Clara's sister falsely accused her of cheating in public and stole her billionaire fiancé. 5 years later, the billionaire recognized Clara's child, a 5-year-old boy he never knew he had. This is a full story inspired by a true-life event. You can save it to binge later. Subscribe to help me reach 500 subscribers by May and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from. Thank you for doing that. The story starts like this. The room had gone quiet. Not the soft quiet of a party winding down, not the polite hush before someone made a toast. This was a different kind of silence, heavy. Clara felt it before she understood it. The violin music had faltered somewhere behind her. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Even the gentle clinking of champagne glasses seemed to vanish all at once. She stood near the center of the ballroom, the polished marble floor gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers the size of small cars. White roses overflowed from every table. Golden light shimmered across silk gowns and tailored suits. This was not just a party. It was their engagement celebration. Alexander had invited everyone who mattered, his business partners, his closest friends, his relatives, investors and colleagues who had watched him build his empire. Clara's own world was here too. Her friends, her family, people who had watched her and Alexander fall in love. Tonight was supposed to be the moment their two lives, two worlds officially became one. A moment ago, the ballroom had been alive with laughter and congratulations. Now people were staring at her. Clara frowned slightly, tightening her fingers around the stem of her champagne glass. A strange warmth crept up the back of her neck. Why were they looking at her like that? The whispers began, quiet at first, then spreading through the room like ripples. Is that her? I can't believe it. Poor Vanessa. Clara's heart skipped. Vanessa? Her gaze drifted across the ballroom, searching for her sister among the crowd. Vanessa had been here earlier, perfectly composed, elegant, smiling for photos. Clara's chest tightened. This was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of her life. Alexander's engagement celebration. The man she loved stood near the stage at the far end of the ballroom, speaking with several of his business partners. Tall, composed, effortlessly commanding the room even when he wasn't trying. In a few minutes, he was supposed to make an announcement. Their future. Their wedding. Clara's engagement ring caught the chandelier light as she adjusted it nervously. The diamond flashed brightly. Proof of promises. Proof that she belonged here. She had never felt completely comfortable at these lavish events. The wealth, the attention, the endless scrutiny. It could be overwhelming. But tonight was different. Tonight she belonged here. Or at least, she had thought she did. The whispers grew louder. Clara felt dozens of eyes on her. Then someone gasped. Heads turned toward the grand staircase at the edge of the ballroom. Clara followed their gaze, and her stomach dropped. Vanessa stood at the top of the stairs. Her sister's makeup was slightly smudged, as if she had been crying. Her blonde hair, usually styled perfectly, looked slightly disheveled. And her expression, broken. Vanessa clutched the railing as she slowly descended the staircase. The room parted for her. Guests stepped aside, murmuring softly, "Oh my God! Look at her! What happened?" Clara's chest tightened. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Vanessa?" Clara called gently as her sister approached. Vanessa didn't answer right away. Her eyes were red. Her lips trembled. And when she finally looked up, there was something in her expression that sent a chill down Clara's spine. Hurt. But beneath it, something sharper. Vanessa stopped a few steps away from her. The entire ballroom had fallen silent. Dozens of guests leaned closer. Clara glanced around, confused. "Vanessa, what's wrong?" Her sister's voice came out hoarse. "I didn't want to do this here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara blinked. "Do what?" Vanessa swallowed hard. "I didn't want to ruin tonight." She lifted a shaking hand to her mouth as if trying to hold back tears. "But I can't stay silent anymore." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Vanessa, I don't understand." Vanessa's voice cracked. "You slept with my boyfriend." The words cut through the ballroom like shattered glass. For a moment, Clara thought she had misheard. "What?" Vanessa's shoulders trembled. "You thought I wouldn't find out about you and Tom?" The name hit Clara like a slap. Tom. Thomas Spader. Vanessa's boyfriend. Clara stared at her sister, stunned. "What are you talking about?" Shock rippled through the crowd. Guests who had been smiling moments earlier now stared in disbelief. She slept with her sister's boyfriend? At her own engagement party? That poor girl. Vanessa wiped a tear from her cheek. You betrayed me with Tom, Clara. Clara shook her head in disbelief. That's insane. Vanessa let out a broken laugh. I trusted you. The words sounded painfully sincere. And suddenly everyone in the room was looking at Clara differently, not with curiosity anymore, with judgment. Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I wish I was wrong, she whispered. I really do. Her thumb moved across the screen, then she turned the phone toward the crowd. I found these. Several guests leaned closer. A quiet gasp escaped from someone near the front. Clara stepped forward instinctively. What are you doing? Vanessa held the phone higher. On the screen was a string of text messages. Clara froze. Her name appeared at the top. The messages underneath twisted her stomach. I miss you. We shouldn't be doing this. Meet me tonight. Clara's breath caught. I never sent those. Vanessa's lips trembled. You're still lying? I didn't write those. Vanessa swiped to the next image. A photograph appeared. It showed Clara standing close to Tom Spader in what looked like a hotel lobby. The angle made it look intimate. Far too intimate. Clara's heart began to pound. That's not what it looks like. Another swipe. A hotel reservation confirmation appeared. 2 names listed. Thomas Spader, Clara Bennett. A murmur of disgust spread through the crowd. Clara felt like the floor had shifted beneath her feet. This is insane, she said, shaking her head. Vanessa, none of this is real. Someone altered it. Vanessa wiped another tear from her cheek. I wish that were true. Clara's voice rose. It is true. She looked around desperately. I never did this. I would never betray you like that. But the crowd wasn't listening. They were watching, judging, whispering. She cheated on Alexander too. Imagine bringing that kind of scandal here. Poor Vanessa. Clara's chest tightened painfully. No, she whispered. That's not what happened. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand nearby and shattered against the marble floor. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room. Clara's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then she felt it, a presence behind her. Alexander. He stepped forward slowly, his tall frame cutting through the crowd. The room parted for him. Everyone watched him, not just as a man, but as the host, the groom-to-be, the man whose engagement party had just turned into a scandal. Clara turned to face him. For a moment, she saw something in his expression that made her chest ache. Confusion, shock, but beneath it, disappointment. Alexander, she said quietly. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved from Clara to the phone in Vanessa's trembling hand and back again. The silence stretched painfully. Finally, he spoke. Is it true? The question hit her like a punch. Clara stared at him. You can't seriously believe this. His jaw tightened. I asked you a question. No. Her voice came out stronger this time. I would never betray you or Vanessa. Behind him, Vanessa sniffed softly. I didn't want him to find out like this, she whispered. I tried to keep quiet. Clara looked at her in disbelief. You're lying. Vanessa slowly shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. I wish I was. The crowd shifted again. Phones lifted discreetly. Someone whispered, Unbelievable. Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. She looked back at Alexander. You know me. He didn't respond. You know I would never do this. Alexander's gaze flickered briefly toward the images on Vanessa's phone, then back to Clara, and the hesitation in his eyes cut deeper than anything else. Alexander, she whispered. Vanessa reached for his arm. He didn't pull away. That small gesture felt like a knife sliding into Clara's chest. Vanessa's voice broke again. I didn't want to ruin your night, she said softly, but you deserve to know the truth. Clara shook her head slowly. This isn't the truth. But the room had already decided. The whispers had turned colder, sharper. Alexander inhaled slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled. I trusted you. Clara felt something inside her break. I didn't do this. The words came out as little more than a whisper. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Then he said the words that shattered everything. You should leave. The ballroom seemed to tilt. What? I think it's best if you go. Clara stared at him, waiting for the moment when he would realize how absurd this all was, when he would defend her, when he would laugh and say it was impossible. But that moment never came. The room was silent, hundreds of eyes watching, judging, waiting. Clara suddenly felt very small in the middle of the glittering ballroom. The engagement ring on her finger caught the chandelier light again. A moment ago, it had felt like a promise. Now it felt like a weight she could barely carry. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because in that moment, one terrible truth settled in her chest. The man she loved believed she had betrayed him, and her life had just shattered in front of everyone. Clara didn't remember deciding to move. One moment she was standing in the center of the ballroom, the air thick with whispers and judgment, the glittering chandeliers reflecting off hundreds of eyes fixed on her. The next moment, her feet were carrying her forward. The music had stopped. That was the first thing she noticed. The orchestra that had been playing soft celebratory music for her engagement party had fallen silent, their instruments hovering in the air as if even the musicians didn't know what to do. Glasses hung frozen halfway to lips. Conversations collapsed into murmurs. People stared, some with pity, some with quiet disgust, others with the uncomfortable curiosity people reserved for tragedies that did not belong to them. Clara kept walking. Her heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor. Each step echoed through the silence, the sound sharp and humiliating in the enormous room. A woman near the champagne table leaned toward her friend, whispering something behind her hand. Someone else lifted a phone slightly, pretending to check a message. But Clara saw the lens, pointed directly at her. Recording, of course. The scandal of the night. Her chest tightened, as if something heavy had settled inside it. Don't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. She kept her eyes forward. But despite herself, she looked back once. Just once. Alexander stood near the center of the room, tall, motionless, perfectly composed. Beside him, Vanessa clung to his arm, her shoulders trembling as she cried into his suit jacket. The image carved itself into Clara's memory, her sister's tears, Alexander's silence. Clara slowed for a fraction of a second, waiting, just for a moment, for him to move, for him to say something, to call her name, to stop her. But he didn't. He only watched her leave, and the memory of his voice echoed in her mind again. You should leave. Clara's fingers tightened around the engagement ring, the diamond pressed against her skin. Without thinking, she touched it with her thumb, feeling the cool metal, the smooth stone. Just hours ago, that ring had felt like a promise, a future. Now it felt like something else entirely. Heavy. She lowered her hand and kept walking. At the far end of the ballroom, the tall double doors opened as a staff member pulled them wide. Cold night air rushed inside. Clara stepped through them without slowing. Behind her, the music slowly began again. Soft, tentative, as if the party was trying to continue, as if nothing had happened, as if her life had not just collapsed in the middle of the room. Outside, the night air struck her like cold water. The mansion's driveway stretched ahead, lit by rows of elegant garden lights and lined with expensive cars. Two valets stood near the entrance. They tried not to stare. They failed. Clara could feel their eyes on her as she walked past. Further down the driveway, several guests had stepped outside for air. Their conversation stopped the moment they saw her. One woman looked away quickly. Another leaned toward the man beside her, whispering something that made him glance over his shoulder. Clara didn't acknowledge any of them. She simply kept walking. Her heels clicked against the stone path. Behind her, the mansion glowed with warm golden light. Music floated faintly through the open doors. Inside, people were still drinking champagne, still celebrating. Her engagement party. The gate opened automatically as she approached. Beyond it, the city stretched into the night. A taxi slowed beside her a few minutes later. The driver leaned out of the window. Miss? Need a ride? Clara didn't stop walking. Miss? She shook her head once. Her feet carried her forward along the sidewalk. Streetlights reflected off the pavement. Rain from earlier in the evening had left the streets damp, turning the asphalt into a blurred mirror of neon lights and passing headlights. Cars rolled by. Somewhere down the block, people laughed loudly. A bar door opened and closed. Life continued. Clara wrapped her arms around herself as she walked. She didn't know where she was going. Home, eventually, but not yet. Her mind kept replaying the scene in the ballroom. Vanessa's voice, trembling, accusing. The words still sounded unreal. The betrayal, the lies. And Alexander, his expression when Vanessa spoke. Not anger, not outrage, not the fierce defense Clara had imagined he would show if anyone ever accused her of something like that. Instead, uncertainty, distance, as if he didn't know who to believe. Clara swallowed hard. Her chest tightened again. He didn't believe me. Or maybe worse, He hadn't believed her enough. She passed a brightly lit restaurant where couples sat near the windows, laughing over dinner and glasses of wine. A man reached across the table to take his girlfriend's hand. The woman smiled at him. Clara turned her head away quickly. Further down the street, a jewelry store window glowed under soft golden lights. Rows of diamond rings sparkled inside the display. For a moment, Clara slowed. Her fingers moved instinctively toward her hand. The engagement ring caught the streetlight, sending a sharp flash of light across the pavement. Her stomach twisted. She kept walking. The city hummed around her. Engines, footsteps, music drifting from distant doorways. But inside her head, there was only one sound, Alexander's voice. You should leave. Halfway down the next block, the world tilted. Clara slowed. A wave of dizziness passed through her suddenly. She reached out, pressing her hand against a lamppost to steady herself. The metal felt cold under her palm. Her stomach churned. For a moment, she closed her eyes. It's just stress. Of course it was. Tonight had been... She exhaled slowly. Humiliating, devastating. Her entire future had been torn apart in front of hundreds of people. Anyone would feel sick. She pushed herself away from the lamppost and started walking again, but the nausea didn't disappear. It followed her down the street like a shadow. By the time she reached her apartment building, the lobby clock read 12:03 a.m. The building was quiet. The hallway lights were dim. Clara unlocked her door and stepped inside. Silence greeted her. A small living room, a couch with a folded blanket draped across corner, a lamp casting warm light beside a stack of medical textbooks on the coffee table. Home, usually the place where she could breathe again. Tonight it felt unfamiliar, too quiet, too empty. Clara closed the door behind her, the silence pressed in, no whispers, no cameras, no curious eyes, just stillness. Her shoulders sagged. She walked slowly into the living room and lowered herself onto the couch. For several moments she didn't move, didn't think, didn't breathe very deeply. Then her eyes drifted to her hand. The diamond ring glittered faintly beneath the lamp. Clara stared at it. Memories rose uninvited. Alexander standing in the park last spring. The way he had looked strangely nervous for a man who normally commanded boardrooms without effort. The quiet way he asked her to marry him. The softness in his eyes when she said yes. The feeling that the entire world had paused around them. He had looked at her like she was the only person who existed. Clara's chest tightened painfully. Then another memory followed. Alexander in the ballroom tonight. His expression unreadable. His voice quiet. You should leave. Clara closed her eyes. Her fingers slowly curled around the ring. After a long moment, she slipped it off. The absence of its weight felt strange. She turned it in her palm. The diamond caught the light again, sending a faint shimmer across the table. She could throw it away, drop it into the trash, end the promise it represented. Instead, Clara leaned forward and placed it gently on the coffee table. The ring rested there inside the circle of lamplight. Silent. Still. Final. She leaned back against the couch, her stomach twisted again, harder this time. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth and stood quickly. The bathroom light clicked on. She barely made it to the sink before the nausea overwhelmed her. When it passed, she gripped the edge of the counter, breathing slowly. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror. Pale, eyes red, hair slightly disheveled. She looked like someone who had just lost everything. Clara rinsed her mouth and turned off the faucet. But the dizziness didn't fade. Instead, it deepened. Her stomach tightened again. She pressed a hand against it instinctively. Something about the feeling was different. Not just stress, not just shock. Her brow furrowed. Then a thought surfaced. Small, quiet, almost forgettable. Her period. Clara froze. When had it been? Her mind rushed back through the past weeks. Hospital shifts, wedding planning, dinner with Alexander. Another realization settled slowly over her. It had been late, she had noticed. But she had been busy. Distracted. She swallowed. No, she whispered to the empty room. Her eyes drifted toward the cabinet beneath the sink. Inside, tucked behind a bottle of vitamins and a box of bandages, sat a small rectangular package. She had bought it weeks ago, just in case. Clara stared at the cabinet for a long moment before opening it. The box sat exactly where she remembered. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. The instructions were simple. She followed them automatically, her mind strangely quiet. Then she set the test down on the bathroom counter and waited. The seconds stretched painfully. The small clock on the wall ticked softly. Clara stared at the plastic window. One line meant negative. Two lines meant... She forced herself to breathe slowly. This was ridiculous. Tonight had been chaos. Stress could delay things. Stress could cause nausea. Her eyes remained fixed on the test. Slowly, another line began to appear. Faint, but undeniable. Clara's breath caught. The room became very still. She picked up the test with shaking fingers. Two lines. Pregnant. For a long moment, Clara didn't move. Her mind refused to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. Pregnant. Alexander's child. A sound escaped her throat. No. The word barely reached the air. Her free hand drifted slowly down to her stomach. Flat. Unchanged. But suddenly, everything felt different. Her future. Her life. Everything had shifted again, and Alexander would never know. Clara sank slowly down until she was sitting on the cool bathroom floor. The pregnancy test rested loosely in her hand. Outside the window, the city continued moving. Cars passed. Lights glowed. Somewhere far away, people laughed. But inside the small bathroom, the world had narrowed to one impossible truth. Clara closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. What am I going to do? Her voice sounded small in the quiet room. She opened her eyes again and looked at the test. Two lines. Clear. Final. Her fingers brushed her stomach once more. Fear curled tightly inside her chest, and beneath it, something unexpected, something fragile. A quiet, instinctive protectiveness. Clara exhaled slowly. He'll never know, she whispered. The words settled softly into the silence, and the longest night of her life stretched on. Morning came quietly, not with rest, not with peace, just with light. A pale beam of sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of Clara's apartment and stretched slowly across the living room floor. Dust floated through the air, drifting lazily in the golden strip of light. Clara had not moved from the couch. She had not slept. Her body felt strangely heavy, as if the night had settled into her bones. At the same time, there was a hollow space in her chest that refused to close, as if something essential had been pulled out of her and taken away. The apartment was silent. No music, no voices, no whispers. Just the distant hum of traffic slowly waking somewhere beyond the windows. Her eyes opened slowly. For a brief second, there was confusion. A fragile moment when her mind had not yet caught up with the reality of the night before. Then she saw it. The engagement ring. It lay exactly where she had placed it hours earlier, on the glass coffee table beside the couch. The diamond caught the early sunlight, sending a sharp reflection across the surface. It looked bright, perfect, untouched. Nothing about it suggested the night that had destroyed everything. Clara stared at it for a long time. Fragments of the previous evening drifted through her mind like broken glass. The ballroom, crystal chandeliers, the quiet shift in the crowd, Vanessa crying, the whispering guests, Alexander standing beside her sister, and then his voice, calm, controlled, final. You should leave. Clara closed her eyes. The words still didn't feel real. It felt as if someone had pressed them directly into her chest and left them there, where they continued to echo long after the room had gone silent. She sat up slowly. Her body moved carefully, as though sudden movement might cause everything inside her to collapse. Her gaze returned to the ring. For months, that ring had meant something else. A future. A promise. A life she had believed in with a quiet certainty that now felt almost embarrassing. She had imagined mornings together. A home that belonged to both of them. Children. A future that had seemed so clear she had never thought to question it. Now the ring looked like something she had borrowed by mistake. Something that had never truly belonged to her. Clara reached for it. The metal felt cold against her fingers. She held it lightly between her thumb and forefinger, watching the diamond catch the morning light. Another memory surfaced without permission. Alexander kneeling in front of her months earlier. His voice, usually so confident, had sounded almost uncertain. Clara, will you marry me? She remembered the way his eyes had looked then. Warm, certain, full of a future they both believed in. Nothing like the distant man who had stood across the ballroom the night before. Clara closed her hand around the ring. Immediately, the memory shattered. His voice replaced it. You should leave. A small breath escaped her. Not quite a sigh, not quite a sob, just something in between. She whispered quietly into the empty room. This is the last thing. The decision had already been made sometime during the endless night. She couldn't keep it, not after everything. Returning the ring was the only way to close this chapter of her life, the last tie between them. She stood slowly. For a moment, her legs felt weak. She steadied herself against the back of the couch until the dizziness passed. The apartment looked the same as it always had. The small kitchen, the narrow hallway, the coat draped over the chair, the quiet, familiar space she had always returned to after long days at the hospital. Yet something about it felt different now. Temporary, like a place she was already leaving behind. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the bathroom door. Behind it, hidden inside the cabinet drawer, was the pregnancy test. Two small pink lines. They had appeared so quietly, so casually, and yet they'd changed everything. Clara's chest tightened slightly. Her hand moved instinctively toward her stomach before she stopped herself. Not now. She could not think about that yet. There would be time to face that truth. Later. First, she had one last thing to finish. The city was waking by the time Clara stepped outside. Morning commuters filled the sidewalks. Cars crawled through intersections. All coffee shops buzzed with people clutching cups and checking their phones. The world looked exactly the same as it had the day before. No one paid attention to her. To them, she was just another woman walking through the city. They had no idea that her life had shattered less than 12 hours earlier. Clara moved steadily through the streets. She kept her coat wrapped tightly around herself. One hand closed around the ring in her pocket. The metal pressed against her palm with every step, a small, constant reminder. As the buildings around her grew taller, the atmosphere of the city shifted. The quiet residential streets faded behind her. Glass towers and polished office buildings replaced them. The financial district, Alexander's world. The skyscrapers reflected the rising sun in sharp flashes of light. Everything here looked precise, structured, controlled. Very different from the warm chaos of the mansion where everything had fallen apart. Clara slowed slightly when the tallest building came into view. Alexander's corporate headquarters, a tower of glass and steel rising high above the street. She had been here once before. During the early days of their engagement, Alexander had shown her the office himself, proud in a quiet way he rarely allowed others to see. At the time, she had been impressed. Now the building looked distant, untouchable. Clara stepped through the revolving doors. The lobby was enormous. Polished marble floors stretched across the room like a mirror. Tall ceilings amplified every quiet sound, the tapping of shoes, the soft chime of elevators, the murmur of morning conversations. Employees moved quickly through the space. Some carried laptops. Others clutched coffee cups as they hurried toward elevators. Clara walked forward. Her footsteps echoed softly against the marble. A few people glanced at her, then glanced again. Recognition flickered across their faces. The engagement party scandal had spread quickly. Photos, videos, whispers. Clara could almost hear the thoughts forming behind their polite silence. Is that her? The woman from last night? Alexander Hale's fiancé, or ex-fiancé. But no one said anything out loud. Clara kept walking, her back straight, her head high. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the executive floor. The doors slid shut. The elevator began its smooth climb. Clara watched the numbers change above the door. Each one felt like another step toward closing something forever. The executive floor was much quieter. The hallway was lined with glass offices and minimalist decor. Everything looked expensive, deliberate, professional. At the end of the hallway sat a large desk. Behind it was Alexander's assistant. He looked up as Clara approached. Surprise flickered briefly across his face before professionalism replaced it. "Good morning," he said politely. Clara stopped in front of the desk. Her voice was steady. "I'd like to see Alexander." The assistant hesitated, not long, just long enough to make the answer clear before he even spoke. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "Mr. Hale left early this morning for meetings. He won't be returning today." The words settled quietly between them. Clara nodded once. She had expected that. Maybe part of her had hoped for it. No confrontation, no explanations, just the ending. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket. She placed the ring gently on the desk. The diamond caught the overhead light instantly. The assistant's eyes widened slightly. Recognition came immediately. The engagement ring, the one the media had admired for weeks. Clara spoke softly. "I came to return this." The assistant looked from the ring to Clara, The situation was clearly uncomfortable, but he kept his voice respectful. "I understand," he said. Then he hesitated again. "I'm afraid I can't accept personal items on Mr. Hale's behalf." Clara blinked. "What do you mean?" "Company policy," he explained. "Anything personal must be handed to him directly." Silence stretched between them. Clara looked at the ring, then at the assistant. Taking it back was not an option, but seeing Alexander again was something she could not allow herself to do, not after last night. The assistant seemed to sense her hesitation. After a moment, he said carefully, "There may be another solution." Clara looked up. "I could place the ring inside Mr. Hale's office safe until he returns." He gestured toward the glass door behind him. "Only he has access to it. It will remain secure." Clara considered the suggestion. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. She nodded once. "That's fine." The assistant picked up the ring carefully. "Please wait here." He walked toward the glass office door. Clara's eyes followed him. The door opened quietly. For the first time since the engagement party, she saw Alexander's office again. It was exactly as she remembered. Wide glass walls, minimalist furniture, a massive desk near the windows. Beyond the glass, the city skyline stretched endlessly in every direction. The room radiated power, control, authority. For a moment, Clara imagined what life might have looked like if everything had gone differently. If she had walked into that office not as a stranger, but as Alexander's wife. The thought faded quickly. The assistant moved toward a discreet metal panel behind the desk. He opened the safe. The door swung outward with a soft mechanical sound. Clara watched as he placed the ring carefully inside. For a brief moment, the diamond flashed under the office lights. Then the safe door closed. A quiet metallic click echoed through the room. The sound felt final. The assistant returned moments later. "It will remain there until Mr. Hale returns," he said politely. Clara nodded. "Thank you." She turned and walked toward the elevators. The hallway felt longer this time. The elevator ride down passed in silence. When the doors opened onto the lobby again, the building had grown busier. More people, more movement, more voices. Clara crossed the marble floor and stepped outside. The morning had fully arrived. Cars rushed past, pedestrians filled the sidewalks. The city was alive and completely indifferent to everything that had happened. Clara stopped at the edge of the street. Behind her, the skyscraper rose high into the bright sky. She looked up at it for a long moment. Then, without thinking, her hand rested gently against her stomach. The movement felt instinctive, protective. The secret inside her shifted the weight of everything. She had returned the ring. She had closed that door. Alexander would move on. The world would continue. Clara lowered her gaze. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Now it's over." But somewhere deep inside, a quiet truth remained. Nothing about this story was over. Not yet. The glass tower glittered in the late morning sun. Clara stood across the street from it, unmoving, as if the city had forgotten to push her forward with everyone else. Cars surged past in impatient bursts. Shoes struck the pavement in quick, purposeful rhythms. Someone shouted into a phone. A horn blared behind her. Life continued. But Clara felt suspended outside of it. The skyscraper rose into the sky like a monument to something she had almost possessed. A life she had nearly touched and had just lost. The tower's mirrored windows caught the sunlight and flung it back toward the city in blinding flashes. Inside those walls were quiet boardrooms, polished marble floors, and people who belonged to Alexander's world. A world built on power, on wealth, on control. A world that had just rejected her in the most brutal way possible. Clara swallowed, forcing air into her lungs. Her chest still burned with the memory of it. The whispers, the stares, the humiliation that had unfolded in front of people who would remember it for years. Her mind drifted toward him despite herself, Alexander, his voice, the tension in his jaw, the look in his eyes when everything had spiraled beyond control. The memory flickered like a spark, then faded, because something else demanded her attention now. Slowly, almost without thinking, Clara's hand rose and rested against her stomach. Her fingers pressed gently through the thin fabric of her shirt. The thought returned, heavy and impossible to ignore. The baby. Her throat tightened. The future suddenly felt enormous and terrifying. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. The words dissolved into the noise of traffic. She looked up at the tower again. Alexander was somewhere inside that building, working, making decisions. living his powerful, carefully controlled life. He had no idea that something irreversible had already begun. Clara lowered her gaze, and for the first time since everything collapsed that morning, her thoughts shifted away from him. They moved toward the fragile life growing quietly inside her. Alexander was no longer the center of the problem. The baby was. Clara began walking. She didn't choose a direction. Her feet simply carried her away from the tower, away from the building that had witnessed the worst moment of her life. The city wrapped around her in its usual restless motion. People hurried past with phones pressed to their ears. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. A bus exhaled loudly as its doors opened to swallow a crowd of passengers. Everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, as if the world had decided her heartbreak wasn't important enough to notice. Clara crossed an intersection without remembering the light changing. A gust of wind lifted strands of her hair as she moved through the crowd. Then she noticed them. A father and a little girl walking along the opposite sidewalk. The girl couldn't have been older than 4. Her small hand wrapped around his fingers while a bright pink backpack bounced against her shoulders. She laughed at something he said. The sound floated across the street. Light. Carefree. Clara's chest tightened. Her hand returned to her stomach. A few steps later, a young couple pushed a stroller past her. The baby inside kicked happily beneath a soft blanket. The woman bent down to adjust the tiny hat on the child's head while the man watched her with quiet affection. The moment was simple, ordinary, but it struck Clara like a sudden blow. Her breathing grew shallow. Then another image appeared ahead. A pregnant woman stood outside a cafe while her partner held the door open for her. She was laughing, one hand resting naturally on the curve of her stomach. The gesture was effortless, familiar, as if carrying a child was simply another part of everyday life. Clara stopped walking. The truth she had been avoiding all morning settled over her like cold water. She was pregnant. Not hypothetically, not eventually. Now. Real. Immediate. Permanent. The baby would come whether she was ready or not. Her heart began pounding harder. The city sounds blurred together until they became a distant roar. By the time Clara reached her apartment building, the sun had drifted lower in the sky. The hallway outside her door felt strangely unfamiliar, as though she were stepping back into someone else's life. She unlocked the door. The apartment greeted her with silence. Everything remained exactly the way she had left it. Books stacked neatly on the desk, a coffee mug still beside the sink, soft afternoon light slipping through the curtains. Clara stood just inside the doorway. Memories seemed to linger in the air, late nights studying for exams, long phone calls with Alexander that stretched past midnight, quiet evenings when she had believed her future was opening in front of her like a wide road. Now the rooms felt hollow, like a stage after the play had ended. She walked slowly into the bathroom. The pregnancy test still rested on the counter. Clara stared at it, her pulse quickened. She already knew what it would show, but some fragile part of her hoped irrationally that it might be different now. She picked it up with trembling fingers. 2 pink lines. Clear, unmistakable, unchangeable. The truth. Clara sank down onto the edge of the bathtub. Fear rose inside her like a rising tide. Questions flooded her mind faster than she could control them. How am I supposed to do this alone? She was still finishing her medical training. Her finances were uncertain. Her life had already collapsed once today. A baby would change everything. Her thoughts shifted suddenly. Alexander, what would happen if he found out? Would he believe her, or would he think she was lying to trap him? And then a darker possibility surfaced. Vanessa. Clara's stomach twisted. Vanessa had already destroyed her reputation once. Publicly. Cruelly. If she discovered Clara was carrying Alexander's child... Clara's breath caught. Powerful people protected their lives, their reputations, their secrets. Vanessa certainly would. And Clara suddenly understood something with frightening clarity. The baby could never become part of that world, never become another weapon in someone else's war. The child had to be protected, hidden, safe. Her hand drifted to her stomach again. The fear remained. But beneath it, something stronger was beginning to take shape. Responsibility. Clara sat there for a long time. The apartment seemed to shrink around her. Too many memories, too many reminders of Alexander. Too many people in the city who knew his name, who might recognize hers. If she stayed here, the truth would eventually surface. And if it did, her child would grow up surrounded by scandal, gossip, and power struggles. Clara slowly shook her head. No, she murmured. She stood. Her voice steadied as she spoke again. We'll start somewhere new. The words surprised her. But the moment they left her lips, they felt right. For the first time since morning, the fog in her mind began to lift. Clara pulled a suitcase from the closet and set it on the bed. The zipper sounded loud in the quiet apartment. She folded clothes carefully, one piece at a time. Shirts, jeans, sweaters, each movement deliberate. Controlled. Then her hand paused. A framed photograph rested on the nightstand. Clara picked it up. The picture showed her and Alexander standing on a balcony overlooking the city skyline. They were smiling. Happy. For a moment, she stared at it. The memory attached to the image felt like it belonged to someone else now. Slowly, she placed the frame back on the table. She left it there. Some memories were meant to stay behind. She continued packing. Her hospital badge sat in the drawer of her desk. Clara picked it up. The plastic surface caught the fading light. Years of effort. Years of sacrifice. Everything she had built was tied to that small piece of plastic. She placed it gently in the suitcase. Her fingers brushed against a gray sweater folded in the corner of the drawer. Alexander had given it to her during their first winter together. She hesitated, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the suitcase. Not because of him, because it was warm, because she might need it. Clara opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The screen illuminated the dim room. She typed slowly. The email was short, formal, professional, no explanations, no emotion, just a resignation. She read it once, then pressed send. A quiet finality settled over her. The suitcase stood beside the door. Clara walked through the apartment one last time. Her fingers brushed the back of a chair, the edge of the kitchen counter, the wall beside the window where pale sunlight still slipped through. So many evenings had passed here, moments that once felt important. Now they were simply echoes. She turned off the lights, then stepped outside. The door closed behind her. The soft click of the lock sounded like the end of a life. The taxi driver barely glanced at her as she slid into the back seat. "Where to?" he asked. Clara hesitated. Then she gave him the name of the highway leading out of the city. The car pulled into traffic. Buildings rose around them in dark silhouettes against the fading sky. Office lights flickered on one floor at a time. The skyline shifted slowly as the taxi moved through the streets. Clara watched silently through the window. The city that had once held her entire future began shrinking behind her. Streetlights blurred into streaks of gold. Traffic hummed steadily around them. Her hand moved to her stomach again. This time the feeling was different. The fear remained, but something stronger had taken root beside it. Determination. Clara rested her palm gently against her abdomen. "I'll protect you," she whispered. The taxi reached the highway just as night settled over the city. Rows of headlights stretched endlessly ahead. Behind them, the skyline faded into darkness. Somewhere in one of those towering buildings, Alexander continued his life, working, planning, unaware that everything had already changed. He didn't know the woman he once loved had vanished from his world, and that his child was leaving the city with her. The taxi merged into the endless river of traffic, and Clara disappeared into the night. The taxi moved steadily along the empty highway, its headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the darkness. Clara sat in the back seat with her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, the wool gathered in her fists as if the fabric itself might keep the pieces of her life from falling apart. Outside the window, the city she had known all her life was slowly disappearing. The glowing towers, the glass buildings, the bright streets where she had once believed her future was waiting. Only an hour ago, those streets had been full of music, laughter, and champagne glasses. Now they were shrinking in the rear window, fading into distant sparks of light against the night sky, like stars, too far away to reach. Clara watched them until they vanished completely. She had expected the pain to be louder. Anger, humiliation, something sharp enough to break through the numbness sitting inside her chest. But instead, there was only a strange quiet, a hollow calm. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers woven tightly together. Every few seconds, the taxi passed beneath a street lamp. Soft yellow light spilled briefly across the back seat, catching the faint reflection of her face in the window. For a moment, she could see herself. Then the darkness returned. The driver didn't try to make conversation. The radio was off. Only the steady hum of the engine filled the car. And in that silence, when there was nothing left to distract her, Clara's mind finally began to wander. Memories surfaced the way they always did when life became too quiet, uninvited, persistent. And somehow tonight, every memory led back to the same person, Vanessa, her sister. The memory began around a dinner table. Clara could almost smell the food again, her mother's roasted chicken, fresh bread still warm from the oven, the familiar yellow kitchen light that always made the room feel safe. She and Vanessa sat across from each other, their school backpacks leaning against the wall. Their father was studying 2 report cards. He adjusted his glasses carefully, scanning each page with the seriousness he always gave to numbers and grades. "Well," he said slowly. Clara remembered sitting very still. Her father looked up first, at her. Clara got the highest grade in mathematics again. A proud smile spread across his face. "You've always been good with numbers." Young Clara nodded politely, unsure what else to do with the praise. Across the table, Vanessa stared down at her plate. Her mother quickly picked up the other report card. "Oh, but look at this," she said brightly. "Vanessa improved a lot this semester." She placed a comforting hand on Vanessa's shoulder. "Vanessa works very hard." Their father nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, effort matters more than talent." Clara remembered glancing toward her sister. Vanessa still wasn't smiling. Her fork moved slowly through the food on her plate, pushing the chicken from one side to the other. Clara didn't understand the look on her sister's face then. She was only a child. But now, years later, Clara could recognize the expression clearly. It was the first spark of something small and dangerous. Not anger, not hatred. Just a quiet resentment. A seed planted so early that no one noticed it growing. The next memory arrived with the echo of applause. A school auditorium filled with parents and teachers. Rows of children whispering excitedly while waiting for the annual academic awards ceremony to begin. Clara had been 9 years old. Vanessa was 8. Both of them had entered the school competition that year. Clara had won. She remembered walking up the steps toward the stage while the room clapped politely. A teacher leaned down with a warm smile and pinned a blue ribbon to her dress. "Excellent work, Clara." The ribbon felt heavier than she expected. She turned toward the audience, instinctively searching for her parents. Her mother was clapping proudly. Her father nodded approvingly. But Vanessa wasn't clapping. Vanessa was crying. The sight startled Clara. Her sister sat beside their parents, her face red and wet, shoulders shaking as she tried unsuccessfully to hide the tears. The applause faded. Children returned to their seats. Clara walked slowly back to her chair. Vanessa refused to look at her. Their mother leaned down and whispered softly, "It's all right. You tried very hard." But Vanessa shook her head stubbornly. Clara stared at the ribbon resting in her hand. Bright blue. First place. She looked at her sister again. Vanessa's tears kept falling. Clara leaned closer. "You can have it," she whispered. Vanessa blinked in surprise. "What? You worked hard?" Clara said quietly. "You deserve it too." Vanessa hesitated. Only for a moment, then Clara placed the ribbon in her sister's hand. The crying stopped instantly. At the end of the ceremony, their mother noticed the ribbon. "Oh, Vanessa!" she exclaimed happily. "You won?" Vanessa nodded. Their parents beamed with pride. Clara sat quietly beside them. Even then, at 9 years old, she had already learned something important. Peace inside the family mattered more than being right. So she stayed silent. The taxi rolled gently over a crack in the highway. Clara shifted slightly in her seat. Outside, the sky was beginning to soften. The black horizon was slowly fading to gray. Another memory rose quietly in her mind. High school had changed everything. Vanessa had grown confident, beautiful, magnetic. She was the kind of girl people noticed the moment she entered a room. Clara had grown differently, quieter, more focused on her books. The two sisters moved through different social circles, but occasionally their paths crossed, and when they did, the competition returned. Clara remembered one afternoon in a small cafe near their school. She sat across from a boy in her literature class, Daniel. They were discussing a poem their teacher had assigned. "You make it sound almost interesting," Daniel joked, smiling. Clara laughed softly. At that exact moment, the cafe door opened. Vanessa walked in with 2 friends. She noticed Clara immediately, and Daniel. Clara remembered the way her sister's eyes sharpened for just a second. Then Vanessa walked over. "Well," she said lightly, resting a hand on the table, "what's going on here?" Daniel smiled politely. "We were just talking." Vanessa pulled out a chair without asking and sat down. Her smile was effortless, charming. Within minutes, the conversation had shifted. She teased Daniel, complimented him, made him laugh. Clara watched quietly. She already knew how the story would end. 2 weeks later, Daniel was Vanessa's boyfriend. Clara never mentioned the cafe again. Vanessa never apologized. It simply became another quiet victory. The taxi passed a lonely gas station on the edge of the highway. A faint line of pale light had begun to appear along the horizon. Clara let out a slow breath. The final memory surfaced. This one hurt more than the others, because this time she should have understood. She and Vanessa had been sitting together in the living room of their parents' house. Clara remembered how excited she had been that day. "I met someone," she told her sister. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Clara smiled shyly, "he's different." "Different how?" Clara hesitated. "He's successful." Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "What does he do?" "He runs a tech company." Vanessa's eyes sharpened immediately. "A company? Yes. What kind of company?" Clara laughed nervously. "Vanessa, it's not important." But Vanessa didn't laugh. "How rich is he?" The question felt strange. Clara frowned slightly. "I don't know exactly." Vanessa studied her carefully. "Do you love him?" Clara blushed. "I think I might." Vanessa leaned back slowly. Then she smiled. At the time, Clara had thought it meant happiness, support, sisterly approval. But now, sitting in the back of the taxi years later, Clara finally recognized the truth. That smile had held something else. Something sharper, something calculating, a quiet hunger, and Clara had ignored it completely because she trusted her sister. The taxi continued down the quiet highway. Morning was beginning to rise slowly across the sky. Soft, golden light touched the edges of the clouds. Clara rested her head against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. All the memories lined themselves up now. The comparisons, the competitions, the small victories Vanessa had always needed. A slow understanding settled into Clara's chest. Heavy, inevitable. Vanessa hadn't taken Alexander because she loved him. She had taken him because he belonged to Clara. The pattern had existed their entire lives. Vanessa needed to win, and Clara had spent years quietly stepping aside. A tired smile touched Clara's lips. "I should have seen it," she whispered. Outside the window, the road stretched endlessly ahead, and for the first time since the engagement party, Clara understood something clearly. Her sister hadn't destroyed her life in a single night. The storm had been building for years. Clara had simply refused to see the clouds. And now, at last, she finally could. The memory came quietly, not like the sharp, fractured flashes of childhood that had filled Clara's mind earlier in the night. Those memories had arrived like broken glass. This one unfolded slowly, softly, like opening the door to a warm room she had not stepped into for years. The taxi hummed along the empty road, but Clara barely noticed it now. Her head rested against the cool window, her eyes half closed. Somewhere between night and dawn, her thoughts drifted backward, back to a different version of herself. A younger Clara, a hopeful Clara. The Clara who still believed life moved in straight lines. The Clara who had not yet learned how cruel the world could be. The Clara who had not yet lost him. The pediatric floor of St. Matthew's Hospital always grew quieter in the late afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the chaos of the day began to fade. The busiest rush had passed. Monitors beeped more slowly. The hallways lost their frantic rhythm. Day staff organized charts, while nurses prepared the evening rounds. Clara stood outside room 312, finishing notes on a small tablet. Inside the room, a little boy was sleeping. Earlier that afternoon, he had been crying so hard he could barely breathe. A stubborn fever and a painful throat infection had frightened him more than the illness itself. His small hands had clutched the blanket as if he were trying to hold the world together. Clara had sat beside the bed for almost 20 minutes, not examining him, not writing prescriptions, just talking. She had told him about the cartoon dinosaur stickers she used to collect when she was a child. She had shown him the ridiculous dancing chicken sticker on the back of her phone. She had made the chicken dance across the screen until the boy finally let out a small, surprised laugh. Eventually, he laughed properly. Then he let the nurse give him the medicine. Now he was asleep. His small chest rose and fell in steady, peaceful breaths. Clara stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching through the glass, making sure. She always did that. Just one more look, just one more confirmation that things were okay. Then she signed the final note. "Good work today, doctor," one of the nurses said as she passed by. Clara glanced up and smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a rare compliment." The nurse laughed. Clara slipped her tablet into her bag and pushed the heavy hospital door open. Outside, the evening air was cool and golden. The sun was beginning its slow descent between the tall buildings, painting the city in soft amber light. Doctors and nurses trickled down the hospital steps, exhausted but relieved. Clara stretched her shoulders, feeling the pleasant ache of a long shift settle into her muscles. It had been difficult, but it had mattered, and to Clara, that made everything worth it. Back then, life had felt simple that way. You helped someone, and that was enough. Across the street from the hospital sat a small cafe that Clara visited almost every day after work. It wasn't fancy, just a narrow space with wooden tables, warm lighting, and slightly crooked shelves filled with bags of coffee. But the coffee was strong, and the smell of roasted beans drifted onto the sidewalk in a way that felt almost comforting after long hospital hours. Clara stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. "Same as usual?" the barista asked with a friendly grin. Clara laughed. "Am I that predictable?" "Very." She pretended to sigh. "Then yes, same as usual." She joined the short line near the counter. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversations, low laughter, and the soft clatter of cups against saucers. That was when she noticed him. He stood near the window, speaking quietly into a phone. His voice was low, controlled. "No, move the investors' meeting to tomorrow," he said. A pause. "No, tomorrow." Another pause. His tone never rose. It stayed calm, measured, but there was something about it, something precise and decisive. Clara didn't mean to eavesdrop, but fragments of the conversation reached her anyway. "Cancel the presentation. We'll restructure the deal." "I said tomorrow." He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. Only then did Clara properly notice him. He looked to be in his early 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a dark coat and white shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth or status, but there was something unmistakably composed about him. Not arrogance, not the loud confidence Clara sometimes saw in hospital board members. This was different, quieter, still, like someone who was used to being listened to. Clara looked away quickly before he could notice her staring. A few minutes later, the barista handed Clara her coffee. "Careful, it's hot." Clara nodded, turning slightly as she reached for a napkin. At that exact moment, the man stepped away from the window. They bumped into each other lightly. A splash of coffee tipped over the rim of the cup. "Oh!" Clara stepped back instantly. "I'm so sorry." But the man spoke at the exact same time. "That's my fault. I wasn't watching where I was going." They both paused. Clara blinked. Most people blamed the other person in situations like that. It was almost automatic, but he didn't. Instead, he calmly picked up a napkin from the counter and handed it to her. "Did it spill on you?" "No," Clara said quickly. "Just a little." The barista leaned over the counter. "I'll remake it." "Oh, that's not necessary." "It's fine," the barista insisted. Clara sighed in surrender. The man gestured toward a small table nearby. "You can sit there while you wait." Clara hesitated. The cafe was crowded. Almost every seat was taken. The table he indicated had only one chair occupied. His. "Well, all right," she said. Clara sat carefully across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the golden light of sunset filtered through the cafe windows. The scent of coffee hung warmly in the air. I really am sorry about that," Clara said after a moment. "It was my fault." He shook his head slightly. "Then we'll call it mutual clumsiness." Clara smiled despite herself. "Fair enough." The barista brought her replacement drink. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "So," she said lightly, "should I assume you're negotiating world peace on that phone?" The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Something like that." Their conversation began easily, almost surprisingly easily. He asked if she worked at the hospital across the street. "Yes," Clara said. "Pediatrics." "That sounds difficult." "Sometimes." She shrugged. "But kids are honest. If they hate you, they tell you immediately." That made him laugh. "And if they like you, then you've done something right." He leaned back slightly, studying her. "You seem to enjoy it." Clara nodded. "I do." She paused before asking the question that had been quietly forming. What about you? What about me? Your job. He took a sip of his coffee. I run a technology company. Clara nodded politely. She imagined something small. A startup, perhaps. Sounds stressful. It can be, he didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't press. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then he asked, why pediatrics? Clara tilted her head slightly. Why not? Most doctors prefer less emotional specialties. Clara thought about it. Children are different, she said finally. How? They're honest. She stared into her coffee for a moment before continuing. When adults get sick, they pretend they're fine. They hide things. But children don't. They're scared when they're scared. They cry when something hurts. She looked up again. And they fight harder than anyone I've ever seen. Her voice softened. If helping someone matters, it should matter most when they're small. For a moment he didn't respond. He simply watched her. The expression in his eyes had changed. More thoughtful now. You care about your work, he said quietly. Clara shrugged. Someone should. The conversation continued. One topic flowed naturally into another. The city. Books. Travel. The strange hours of demanding careers. At some point, the cafe grew quieter. The evening rush faded. Clara glanced toward the window. The sun had nearly disappeared. She blinked in surprise. How long have we been sitting here? He checked his watch. Almost an hour. Clara laughed softly. That can't be right, but it was. Neither of them had noticed time passing. Eventually they both stood. Clara slipped her bag onto her shoulder. Well, she said, I should probably go before my apartment forgets what I look like. He smiled faintly. For a brief moment, they stood in the soft evening light near the door. Then he spoke. Would you like to do this again sometime? Clara hesitated. She usually didn't meet strangers. She wasn't the type to exchange numbers with someone she had just met over coffee. But something about him felt different. Calm, steady, safe. Maybe, she said. He took out his phone. Then maybe we should exchange numbers. Clara laughed quietly. That's usually how it works. They traded phones for a moment, saved contact information, then stepped outside. The air had cooled. City lights flickered on one by one. Clara waved lightly. Good night. Good night, Clara. She turned toward the subway entrance a few blocks away. Halfway down the street, she realized something strange. She was smiling. For no particular reason. Just smiling. Behind her, the cafe door closed softly. Clara continued down the sidewalk, the evening city stretching endlessly around her. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than a pleasant conversation with an interesting stranger. A coincidence. A small moment. A simple crossing of two lives that would probably drift apart again. She hadn't known then that the man she met over coffee would change the entire course of her life. She hadn't known how deeply she would love him, or how much losing him would break her, or that 5 years later, she would see him again. 2 weeks after the afternoon in the cafe, Clara had learned something surprising about Alexander. He was persistent. Not in the overwhelming way some men were. Not in the kind of way that demanded attention or tried too hard to impress. Alexander's persistence was quieter than that. It was in the way he appeared at the hospital sometimes after her shifts, in the way he remembered small things she mentioned in passing, in the way he listened. Most of all, it was in the way he kept showing up, not to chase her, but simply to be near her. And somehow, without realizing when it had happened, Clara had begun looking forward to it. The pediatric floor had been unusually busy that day. By the time Clara stepped out through the hospital doors, the muscles in her shoulders felt tight with exhaustion. She rolled them slowly as she adjusted the strap of her bag. Evening light spilled across the wide concrete steps. Nurses filtered out around her, their tired laughter mixing with the distant hum of traffic. Some talked about dinner plans. Others talked about the long shifts waiting for them tomorrow. Clara took 2 steps down the stairs before she noticed the car. A sleek, dark sedan waited quietly at the curb. Alexander leaned against the passenger door, his sleeves rolled just past his wrists. His attention was on his phone, but when the hospital doors opened again, he looked up and smiled. It was the kind of smile that came easily, not practiced, not polite, just warm. Clara stopped halfway down the steps. You again? She called. Alexander slipped his phone into his pocket. You say that like it's a bad thing. Clara continued down the stairs, shaking her head, though a faint smile had already appeared. You do realize billionaires are supposed to be busy. Is that so? She gestured vaguely toward the street. Important meetings, corporate takeovers, secret global tech domination. Alexander opened the car door for her with quiet amusement. I postponed world domination until tomorrow. Clara laughed softly as she slid into the passenger seat. That's very considerate of you. He closed the door gently, then walked around the car. As Clara watched him through the windshield, she caught herself smiling. Seeing him waiting there after work had begun to feel natural, comfortable, like something that belonged in her day. The realization startled her, because for a very long time, nothing in her life had felt quite that easy. They didn't go anywhere expensive. Instead, Alexander parked near a lively street market a few blocks away. Food carts lined the sidewalks, their metal surfaces glowing under strings of hanging lights. Neon signs flickered on as the sky slowly shifted toward evening. The air smelled of grilled meat, garlic, and sweet pastries. Clara raised an eyebrow when Alexander handed her a small paper tray filled with dumplings. Don't tell me this is part of your billionaire lifestyle. Alexander leaned against the railing beside her. It's highly exclusive. Of course. Very difficult to get into. Clara laughed and bit into one of the dumplings. The warmth and spice spread instantly across her tongue. They stood shoulder to shoulder watching the crowd drift past. Office workers in loosened ties. Students laughing too loudly. Parents tugging sleepy children toward home. For a moment, Alexander seemed completely at ease among them. No bodyguards, no luxury cars, no attention. Just another person standing on a sidewalk with street food. Clara glanced sideways at him. You know, she said thoughtfully, most people in your position probably spend their evenings in five-star restaurants. Probably. But you're eating dumplings on a sidewalk. Alexander shrugged lightly. I prefer dumplings. Clara studied him for a moment. The longer she spent around Alexander, the more something about him puzzled her. He didn't act like a man trying to impress her. He didn't brag. He didn't try to dazzle her with money or influence. He simply seemed happy to be there, with her. And somehow that made the warmth in her chest grow stronger. They had walked 3 blocks when Alexander spoke again. There's something I need to attend tonight. Clara glanced up. That sounds ominous. A charity gala. Ah, she nodded knowingly. Fancy clothes, important speeches, people pretending they understand modern art. Alexander smiled faintly. Something like that. They stopped at a crosswalk while traffic passed. Alexander turned slightly toward her. You should come. Clara blinked. With you? Yes. She hesitated. Immediately, images filled her mind. Elegant gowns, crystal chandeliers, rooms filled with people who spoke a language of wealth she didn't understand. It wasn't her world. I don't think I'd fit in very well. Alexander studied her calmly. You'll be fine. You haven't seen my wardrobe. I'm not worried. Clara crossed her arms. That's easy for you to say. You probably attend things like this every week. Unfortunately. So why invite me? Alexander's answer came without hesitation. Because I'd rather spend the evening with you than without you. The words were simple, but they landed with surprising weight. Clara felt warmth spread slowly through her chest. She tried to hide it by sighing dramatically. Well, if I embarrass you, that's entirely your fault. Alexander's smile widened. I'll take the risk. 2 hours later, Clara stepped into a ballroom that looked like something out of a film. Crystal chandeliers hung high above the polished marble floor. Soft orchestral music drifted through the air. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved gracefully between guests, carrying silver trays of champagne. The entire room shimmered. Clara instinctively smoothed the fabric of her dark blue dress. It was simple, elegant, but compared to the glittering gowns around her, it suddenly felt very modest. Alexander noticed immediately. You look perfect, he said quietly. Clara exhaled slowly. That's easy for you to say. No one's judging your dress. He leaned slightly closer. I assure you, he murmured, no one here is paying attention to anything except their own reflection. Clara almost laughed, but before she could reply, a tall man approached Alexander with bright enthusiasm. Alexander, I didn't realize you were attending tonight. Good evening, Richard. They shook hands. The man turned politely toward Clara. And who is this? Alexander answered without hesitation. Clara. The way he said her name felt different. Not formal, not casual, certain. The man nodded respectfully. Pleasure to meet you. As he walked away, another guest approached. Then another. Within minutes, Clara noticed something unusual. People weren't simply greeting Alexander, they were greeting him carefully, respectfully. Some even seemed slightly nervous. Clara leaned closer to him as they stepped aside. You didn't tell me you were this important, Alexander raised an eyebrow. I thought you knew. I thought you ran a tech company. I do. Clara glanced around the ballroom again. The wealthy guests, the polite attention, the subtle deference. You run a very big tech company, don't you? Alexander didn't answer, which was answer enough. Across the ballroom, a familiar voice cut through the music. Well, this is unexpected. Clara turned. Vanessa stood near the edge of the room, a champagne glass resting lightly in her hand. Her dress shimmered under the chandeliers, sleek, perfectly tailored. Her hair fell over one shoulder in glossy waves. She looked like she belonged there, but her gaze had already locked onto Alexander. Clara blinked in surprise. Vanessa? Vanessa approached with effortless confidence. I didn't realize you attended events like this, Clara. Her smile widened slightly. And who is your friend? Clara hesitated only a moment. Vanessa, this is Alexander. Vanessa extended her hand. Alexander took it politely. A pleasure. Vanessa's eyes lingered on him a moment longer than necessary. Well, she said lightly, Clara always had interesting taste. Clara frowned slightly. Vanessa? What? Vanessa lifted one shoulder innocently. I meant it as a compliment. They stood together near the tall windows overlooking the city. Vanessa seemed perfectly at ease in the glittering room. Clara, meanwhile, still felt slightly out of place. So, Vanessa said casually, how did you two meet? In a cafe, Clara answered. Vanessa's eyebrows rose. A cafe? She turned toward Alexander with a soft laugh. You must have been hiding from your usual social circle. Alexander smiled faintly. Something like that. Vanessa studied him carefully. Then she said, almost thoughtfully, Clara has always been very trusting. The word lingered strangely in the air. Clara frowned. What does that mean? Vanessa waved a hand dismissively. Oh, nothing negative. She just tends to see the best in people. She lifted her champagne glass again. I keep telling her she should enjoy life more instead of spending all her time saving children. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Alexander spoke first. I think saving children is a very good use of time. Vanessa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then it returned. Of course. Later that evening, Clara stepped aside to get a glass of water. As she waited near the bar, a voice spoke beside her. You brought your sister. Clara turned. Daniel, Alexander's assistant. He had introduced himself earlier. Yes, Clara said lightly. She appeared unexpectedly. Daniel glanced toward the ballroom floor. Vanessa stood near Alexander, speaking animatedly. She seems very interested in him. Clara blinked. What? Daniel shrugged lightly. I'm just making an observation. Clara followed his gaze. Vanessa stood very close to Alexander, but Clara only smiled. That's just Vanessa. Daniel didn't reply, but the thoughtful look in his eyes lingered as he walked away. A little later, the orchestra softened into a slower piece. Guests drifted toward the dance floor. Clara laughed at something Alexander said. The sound was bright and genuine. Above the ballroom, on the balcony, Vanessa watched. Her gaze moved slowly between them. Alexander leaned slightly toward Clara. His attention never left her. Vanessa tilted her head faintly. Around them, the ballroom glittered with wealth, but Vanessa's focus had narrowed to one thing: Alexander, his confidence, the way people respected him, the quiet authority in the way he stood, and the way he looked at Clara. Down below, Clara and Alexander stepped onto the dance floor. Alexander's hand settled gently at the small of Clara's back. Clara laughed again. From the balcony, Vanessa slowly lifted her champagne glass. Clara had always been lucky, lucky with people, lucky with opportunities, lucky with things that should have belonged to someone else. Her gaze followed Alexander, studying, measuring, calculating. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Luck, Vanessa had learned long ago, was never permanent, and sometimes it could be taken. 5 years can change everything. 5 years ago, Clara walked away from a life that had shattered in a single night. She left behind a city that had suddenly turned cold, a future that had collapsed before it even began, and a man whose silence had cut deeper than any accusation. She left with nothing but 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like broken glass. 5 years later, the world looked different, quieter, smaller, but stronger. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains of Clara's apartment, spreading across the living room floor in a soft golden line. The place wasn't large, just a modest one-bedroom above a small bakery on a quiet street, but it carried a warmth that expensive homes rarely had. A small couch faced a narrow coffee table. A colorful rug covered most of the floor, scattered with toy dinosaurs and plastic blocks. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator in the tiny kitchen just beyond the living space. Most of the drawings were simple: stick figures, crooked houses, smiling suns, crayon rainbows that didn't quite follow the sky. Clara stood by the sink, pouring coffee into a chipped white mug. Steam curled upward as the familiar smell filled the kitchen, rich, warm, grounding. Outside, the city was just beginning to wake. A delivery truck rumbled somewhere down the street. A dog barked once, then again. It was the kind of ordinary morning that once would have seemed invisible to her. Now it felt precious. For a moment, the apartment was quiet. Then a small voice broke the silence. "Mom?" Clara turned. A little boy stood in the hallway, rubbing his eyes, his dark hair sticking in every direction as if sleep had fought with it all night and won. Ethan. He padded into the kitchen wearing dinosaur pajamas, like dragging a green stuffed triceratops by one arm. His eyes, large and curious, were still heavy with sleep. Clara's chest softened instantly. 5 years later, that reaction had never faded. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said gently. Ethan climbed onto the chair at the small kitchen table, his legs swinging beneath it. "Did the sun wake up already?" he asked. Clara smiled. "Yes, it's been awake for a while." Ethan leaned forward, peering toward the window as if he might catch the sun doing something suspicious. His hair fell across his forehead as he tilted his head, studying the light. The expression was so familiar it made Clara pause. The same thoughtful tilt, the same dark hair, the same quiet intensity in his eyes when he concentrated. For a moment, the resemblance struck her with uncomfortable clarity. Alexander. The thought flashed through her mind before she could stop it. Clara quickly turned back toward the counter and reached for the bread. "Toast or cereal?" she asked. "Toast," Ethan answered immediately, "with the strawberry jam." Clara slid 2 slices of bread into the toaster and placed a small bowl of fruit on the table. Ethan watched her carefully, his eyes following every movement as if breakfast preparation were the most fascinating event in the world. "Do you have work today?" he asked. "I do." "At the hospital?" "Yes." "Are there going to be babies today?" Clara laughed softly. "There are always babies." Ethan seemed satisfied with this answer. He picked up a grape, held it up to the light with serious interest, and then popped it into his mouth. The toaster clicked. Clara spread strawberry jam across the toast and placed the plate in front of him. "Eat before it gets cold." Ethan took a large bite and immediately began swinging his legs again under the chair. Clara leaned against the counter, watching him quietly. Sometimes she still couldn't believe he was real. 5 years ago, discovering she was pregnant had felt like the final blow in a life that had already fallen apart. She remembered that night with painful clarity. The small bathroom, the humming overhead light, the pregnancy test trembling in her hands. 2 pink lines. Her first reaction hadn't been joy. It had been fear, a cold, suffocating fear that wrapped around her chest until it was hard to breathe. She had sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, staring at those 2 lines as if they might disappear if she waited long enough. Pregnant. Alone. Her first thought had been Alexander. For one fragile moment, she had considered calling him, telling him everything. Maybe the truth would matter. Maybe he would listen. Maybe he would remember who she was. But then the memory of that night returned. The accusations, the whispers, the humiliation, and the cold way Alexander had looked at her when he chose not to believe her. That memory stopped her. She couldn't go back to that. She couldn't beg someone who had already decided she wasn't worth trusting. So she didn't call. She didn't tell anyone. She packed what little she owned into 2 suitcases and left the city before the pain could swallow her completely. Ethan took another bite of toast. "Mom?" Clara blinked, returning to the present. "Yes? Did dinosaurs eat toast?" She smiled despite herself. "I don't think so." Ethan frowned thoughtfully. "That's sad." Clara reached over and brushed his messy hair back from his forehead. "You should hurry or you'll be late for school." "I'm not late," he said confidently. "I'm early. Finish eating anyway." He nodded seriously and continued chewing. For a few quiet minutes, the apartment filled only with the soft sounds of breakfast. Then Clara's gaze drifted again. Another memory surfaced, a hospital room, dim lights, the quiet hum of medical machines. She remembered the exhaustion so vividly it almost returned. The labor had lasted all night. There had been no one sitting beside her bed, no partner holding her hand, no family waiting outside. Just a tired nurse who squeezed her fingers once and whispered encouragement. And then a cry. Sharp. Sudden. The most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. The nurse placed the tiny bundle in her arms. Ethan had been so small. His eyes had been closed, his fingers curled into delicate fists. Clara had stared at him through tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Something inside her had shifted in that moment. The loneliness was still there. The heartbreak was still there. But it no longer felt like the end of everything because she was holding something new, something that belonged to her, something that made the future possible again. She hadn't lost everything. She had Ethan. Mom? Clara blinked again. Ethan was watching her carefully. You're thinking again. She laughed softly. Am I? Yes. What gave it away? You stopped blinking. Clara picked up her coffee. Well, finish your toast, detective. After breakfast, the morning moved quickly. Clara packed Ethan's small lunchbox while he sat at the table coloring. Crayons rolled across the wooden surface in bright colors. Red, blue, green. He worked with intense concentration, switching crayons with dramatic seriousness. Clara knelt beside him and tied his shoes. You're getting very good at drawing, she said. I'm practicing. For what? For when I'm a grown-up. That's a good plan. Ethan suddenly lifted his paper. Look! Clara took the drawing. 3 figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun. One was clearly Ethan. Another was Clara. Between them stood a tall man with long arms and dark scribbled hair. Clara felt something tighten quietly in her chest. Who's this? She asked softly. Ethan shrugged. A dad. Clara looked down at the drawing again. The childish lines shouldn't have meant anything. But something about the figure, the height, the dark hair, felt disturbingly familiar. She folded the paper carefully. It's a very good drawing, Ethan grinned. Then he tilted his head slightly. Mom? Yes? Where's my dad? The question landed softly in the quiet kitchen, but it carried weight. Clara's fingers paused on the zipper of the lunchbox. For a moment she couldn't move. Ethan watched her patiently, completely unaware that he had just touched the most fragile part of her past. Children had a way of asking the hardest questions with perfect innocence. Clara forced a gentle smile. He's not here right now, she said softly. Ethan considered that. Is he far away? Clara nodded. Yes. Ethan accepted the answer easily and returned to his crayons as if the mystery had already been solved. But Clara's chest felt tight. One day, he would ask again. One day the answers would have to be more than gentle half-truths. She picked up the drawing once more. A mother, a child, and a tall figure with dark hair. For a long moment she stared at it. Then Ethan jumped down from his chair and ran toward the living room, laughing as he chased his stuffed dinosaur across the rug. Clara watched him. Sunlight now filled the apartment completely, warming the walls and scattered toys. 5 years ago, she had lost the man she believed she would spend her life with. She had lost the future she thought was waiting for her. But standing there in the quiet warmth of that small apartment, listening to her son's laughter echo through the room, Clara understood something with quiet certainty. She had not lost everything. Because the child she held in her arms that lonely night had become the center of her entire world. And somewhere far away, the man who had given her that child still had no idea that his son existed. Next morning. Morning light slipped quietly through the thin curtains of Clara's apartment, stretching soft golden lines across the small living room. The place was modest, 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, worn wooden floors, but it carried the gentle warmth of a home built slowly, patiently, piece by piece. Nothing in it was extravagant, but everything in it was earned. A small pair of sneakers waited neatly beside the door. Crayon drawings were scattered across the refrigerator, held up by mismatched magnets collected over the years. Toy cars lay in a loose pile beside the couch, as if they had stopped mid-race sometime the night before. Clara stood at the kitchen counter in a simple sweater and loose pants, pouring coffee into her favorite chipped mug. The dark aroma rose slowly into the quiet apartment, warm, steady, familiar. She took one slow sip. For a moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the silence. 5 years ago, silence had meant loneliness. Now it meant peace. Behind her, a small groan came from the bedroom. Mom, Clara smiled before she even turned around. Good morning, sleepyhead. Ethan shuffled into the kitchen with messy dark hair and half-closed eyes. His pajama shirt was twisted sideways, and one sock had disappeared somewhere during the night. He climbed onto the chair at the table and let his head drop heavily onto the surface. I'm still sleeping, he mumbled. Clara placed a small plate in front of him. Toast, cut neatly into small squares the way he liked. You can sleep after breakfast, she said gently. Right now, you're eating. Ethan lifted his head just enough to inspect the toast. Is it the crunchy one? The only kind you eat. He sighed with great seriousness, as if the morning had already demanded too much from him, but reached for a piece anyway. Clara packed his lunch while he chewed slowly. Apple slices went into a small plastic container, a sandwich wrapped in paper, a juice box. Then quietly she slipped in a tiny folded note while he wasn't looking. Across the room, sunlight caught one of Ethan's drawings on the refrigerator. A crooked house, two stick figures, and a sun that was far too big for the sky. Clara glanced at it for a moment. Her chest warmed in a quiet, steady way. 5 years ago, she had left everything behind, her family, her reputation, the life she thought she would live. But she had gained something far more important. Mom? She turned. Ethan was watching her now with unusually serious eyes. Are you a doctor today? Clara smiled. I'm always a doctor. She walked over and gently fixed the collar of his shirt. But today, I'm your mom first. That seemed to satisfy him. After breakfast, Clara helped him pull on his tiny sneakers. Other foot, she said patiently. He tried again. Better. When she brushed his hair, it refused to stay down. Dark strands kept falling stubbornly across his forehead, just like... Clara stopped the thought before it could finish forming. Ready? She asked. Ethan jumped down from the chair. Ready. Outside, the morning city was already awake. Cars rolled slowly along the street. A bakery on the corner released the warm smell of fresh bread into the cool air. Parents walked beside their children toward the school building a few blocks away. Ethan held Clara's hand as they walked. He swung their joined hands back and forth with the easy rhythm of someone who believed the world was safe. Mom? Yes? Why do pigeons walk funny? Clara laughed softly. I think they believe they're very important. Ethan considered this with great seriousness. That makes sense. They crossed the street together. Ethan skipped ahead for a moment, then ran back to grab her hand again. Clara watched him carefully, the way she always did. Every step he took felt like something fragile she had sworn to protect. She had built this life for him. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every painful memory she chose not to revisit. All of it had been for this small hand in hers. The school playground came into view. Children were already running across the pavement while teachers stood near the gate, greeting parents. Ethan squeezed her hand suddenly. Mom? Yes? You're picking me up today, right? Of course I am. I always come back, she said softly. Ethan grinned. Then he wrapped his arms around her neck. The hug lasted only a second before he ran toward the building with the fearless energy only children have. Clara remained at the gate a moment longer, watching until he disappeared through the doors. Only then did she turn toward the hospital. The pediatric hospital stood only a few streets away. Inside, the atmosphere was completely different from the quiet apartment that morning. Colorful murals covered the walls, cartoon animals, smiling clouds, bright balloons floating across painted skies. Children sat in small chairs in the waiting area while parents tried gently to calm their nerves. Clara stepped through the entrance and quickly tied her hair back. Morning, doctor, a nurse called from the desk. Morning, Maya. Another nurse passed her in the hallway. You've got 2 checkups and 1 fever case waiting. Clara nodded. Send them in. She stepped into the exam room. A small boy sat on the bed clutching a stuffed dinosaur while his mother hovered nervously beside him. The boy eyed Clara with deep suspicion. Hi, Clara said warmly, pulling a chair closer. I'm Clara. He tightened his grip on the dinosaur. It might bite you, he warned. Clara leaned closer to inspect the toy. Oh dear, she whispered. Should I be scared? The boy nodded very seriously. Clara lowered her voice conspiratorially. Then maybe we should make a deal. If the dinosaur behaves, I'll check your throat very quickly. The boy studied the dinosaur carefully, then looked back at her. Okay. The examination took less than 2 minutes. When she finished, Clara smiled. Very brave. The boy puffed out his chest proudly. My dad says I'm brave, he added. Clara paused, only for a second. The moment was small enough that no one else noticed. Then she smiled again. Well, she said softly, I think he's right. Later, between patients, Clara stood near the staff counter holding another cup of coffee. The hospital buzzed around her, phones rang. Nurses hurried through the hallways. Children laughed somewhere down the corridor. For a brief moment, her mind drifted. 5 years ago, she had believed her life was over. Now she stood here in a doctor's coat, helping children, helping families, raising a son who filled every quiet space in her world. She had moved forward. She had survived. And yet, somewhere in the quietest corner of her heart lived a memory she rarely allowed to surface. She pushed the thought gently away. There were patients waiting. By the time afternoon arrived, the hospital had grown quieter. Clara hung up her coat and stepped outside just as the sky softened into pale gold. The school playground was loud again. Children ran across the pavement while teachers stood near the gate. Ethan spotted her immediately. Mom! He ran toward her with a piece of paper clutched in his hands. Clara knelt just in time to catch him as he crashed happily into her arms. Look, he said breathlessly. He held up the paper. A drawing. Bright colors. Big shapes. Is this our house? Clara asked. Yes. And this is you? Yes. And this little stick person is you? Ethan nodded proudly. Clara smiled. It's beautiful, he grinned. They started walking home together. Halfway down the street, Ethan looked up at her. Mom? Yes? He hesitated for a moment. Then he asked the question in the same simple tone he used for everything else. Do I have a dad? Clara's steps slowed slightly. The world around them kept moving, cars passing, voices talking, leaves brushing softly in the wind. But inside her chest, something tightened. She looked down at him. Ethan's eyes were only curious. No sadness, no fear, just a child asking a question. Clara took a slow breath. Everyone has a father, she said gently. Where is mine? She squeezed his hand softly. Sometimes fathers live far away. Ethan accepted the answer easily. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he started talking about dinosaurs again. That evening, the apartment smelled like tomato soup and toasted bread. Ethan sat at the table, pushing a toy car across the surface while Clara placed their bowls in front of them. Dinner, she announced. He parked the car beside his spoon. During the meal, Ethan talked constantly about school, about dinosaurs, about a boy who could run faster than everyone else. Clara laughed more than she spoke. The apartment felt warm, alive, safe. After dinner, Ethan climbed onto the floor with his crayons. Clara washed the dishes quietly behind him. Mom, he called. Yes? I'm drawing again. She dried her hands and walked over. Ethan held up the paper proudly. 3 figures stood in the drawing, one small, one medium, one tall. Clara's breath caught. The tall figure had dark hair, strong shoulders, a shape she recognized instantly. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. Ethan didn't notice. Who's this? She asked softly. That's you, he said, pointing. And that's me. He tapped the 3rd figure thoughtfully. And that's my dad. Clara forced a gentle smile. It's a very good drawing. Ethan grinned and returned to coloring. Later that night, he fell asleep quickly. Clara sat beside his bed in the dim light of a small lamp. His dark hair curled softly against the pillow. She brushed it away from his forehead. So much of him felt familiar, a resemblance she had tried for years not to see. She had protected him, built a life for him, given him everything she could. But someday, he would want more than answers she could soften. Clara leaned down and kissed his forehead. Then she stayed there for a long moment in the quiet room, because the one secret she carried was growing heavier every day. Meanwhile, on the other side, evening settled over the mansion like a slow, heavy curtain. From the outside, the estate looked exactly the way the city expected it to. Perfect, powerful, untouchable. Tall iron gates guarded the property. Long rows of sculpted hedges lined the winding driveway. Warm, golden lights glowed from enormous windows, making the house appear alive from a distance. A place of influence, a place where powerful people gathered, a place where everything had to be right. But inside, the mansion felt hollow. Marble floors stretched across enormous rooms that rarely held more than silence. Chandeliers hung high above polished ceilings, their crystal arms scattering light across expensive furniture that no one ever truly used. Every surface gleamed. Every line was precise, everything was immaculate, and everything felt empty. Alexander stood near the towering glass windows in the main living room, his suit jacket draped loosely over one arm as he loosened his tie. Below the hill, the city shimmered with thousands of lights. Traffic crawled through glowing streets. Skyscrapers pierced the darkening sky. From up here, the world looked alive. Up here, the mansion felt like a museum, quiet enough that Alexander could hear the faint echo of footsteps somewhere down the hall. A moment later, a voice followed, sharp, controlled. I specifically asked for white orchids, not cream ones. The reply came quickly, strained with nervousness. I'm very sorry, Miss Caldwell, the florist said. I don't care what the florist said. Vanessa stepped into the room. Her heels clicked across the marble floor, each step precise and deliberate. She was already dressed for the evening, wearing a sleek black dress that looked as carefully put together as everything else about her. Elegant, flawless, untouchable. She stopped near the long dining table where several floral arrangement samples had been placed for approval. These will look terrible in photographs, she said, examining the flowers as though they had personally offended her. The staff member nodded quickly. We'll replace them immediately. Vanessa waved a hand without looking up. Please do. Only then did she seem to notice Alexander standing near the window. Oh, she said lightly. You're back. Alexander gave a small nod. I've been back for an hour. Vanessa's expression didn't change. Well, you should have come downstairs sooner. The event planner had questions. Alexander said nothing. Vanessa walked toward the kitchen archway and picked up a tablet from the counter. The charity gala is in 3 weeks, she continued, scrolling through the screen. We need to finalize the guest list tomorrow, and the press interview next week still needs confirmation. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone used to organizing everything around her. Schedules, appearances, reputation. Alexander remained by the window. Do whatever you think is best, he said quietly. Vanessa glanced up. You're the one they're interviewing. Then confirm it. She studied him for a moment. There was a small pause, just long enough to notice that his attention wasn't really on the conversation. You've been distant lately, she said. Alexander's gaze remained fixed on the city. Have I? Vanessa placed the tablet back on the counter. You hardly attend any of the social events anymore. Half the time you disappear into that office. Her voice wasn't accusing. It was analytical, like someone noticing a small flaw in an otherwise perfect machine. Alexander didn't respond. Vanessa sighed lightly. Well, it doesn't matter tonight, she said. We have dinner reservations. I'm not going. The words landed quietly, but they made her stop. Vanessa turned slowly. You're not going? No. Alexander, the mayor will be there. Then you should represent us well. For the first time, a faint edge crept into her voice. This isn't a charity luncheon. It's a political dinner. I know. Vanessa watched him. He hadn't moved from the window, hadn't looked at her once. For a brief moment, something colder flickered behind her composed expression. Then it vanished. Fine, she said smoothly. I'll go alone. She walked toward the hallway, pausing briefly near the doorway. Oh, and tomorrow we're meeting with the foundation board at 10. Alexander nodded faintly. Vanessa left. Her footsteps faded down the hallway, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than before. Alexander remained by the window for several seconds, then he exhaled slowly and turned away. He walked through the long corridor toward the back of the mansion. The farther he moved from the main living spaces, the quieter the house became, past guest rooms, past the private library, until he reached the final door at the end of the hallway. Dark wood. Simple, his office. Alexander stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was dim, lit only by a desk lamp and the faint glow of the city beyond the tall glass wall. Unlike the rest of the mansion, this room felt personal. Not comfortable, but personal. Shelves lined one wall, filled with reports, legal files, and financial statements. His desk sat at the center of the room, perfectly organized. No photographs, no decorations, just work. Alexander removed his watch and set it on the desk. Then he lowered himself into a chair and leaned back slowly. The silence here felt different. Not empty, just quiet enough to think. And lately, thinking had become dangerous. His eyes drifted toward the dark window. 5 years. 5 years since that night. He didn't like remembering it, but the memory had a way of finding him anyway. Sometimes in quiet rooms, sometimes during board meetings, sometimes when Vanessa said something that stirred an old echo. The engagement party had been loud. He remembered that clearly. Music, laughter, champagne glasses clinking, then the voice that cut through everything. Vanessa, accusing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. The moment still lived in his memory in fragments. Clara standing in the center of the ballroom, alone. Vanessa's voice describing betrayal, guests whispering, eyes turning, judging, and him believing it. That was the part that never stopped bothering him. Not the humiliation, not the scandal, but the look on Clara's face. She hadn't looked angry. She hadn't looked guilty. She had looked stunned, as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly disappeared. Alexander rubbed a hand slowly over his face. At the time, he had been too furious to notice the details, too proud, too certain. But memory had a cruel way of sharpening over time. Now, when he replayed that night, the images no longer felt as solid as they once had. Something about it felt wrong. Clara hadn't defended herself, not the way an innocent person might have, but she also hadn't pleaded, hadn't begged, hadn't tried to twist the situation. She had simply stood there, silent, as if she had already understood something he hadn't, and then she had left. Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. The next day, he had gone to her apartment. He had expected anger, maybe a confrontation, but the apartment had been empty. The landlord told him she had moved out during the night, no forwarding address, no contact information, nothing. Alexander had asked around, quietly at first, then more directly. Friends, former colleagues, even hospital administrators who might have known where she worked, but every path ended the same way. Nothing. Clara had disappeared, completely. At first, he had felt relieved. It had seemed easier that way, cleaner. But the relief hadn't lasted long. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly something else settled in, something quiet, something persistent. Doubt. Alexander stood up and walked toward the tall cabinet built into the wall. He unlocked the lower compartment with a small key. Inside sat a compact safe. The metal door opened with a soft click. For a moment, he simply stared inside. Then he reached in and lifted a small velvet box. It rested easily in his palm, untouched, unopened for months, maybe longer. Alexander returned to the desk and sat down. He opened the box. The engagement ring caught the lamplight immediately. A brilliant diamond, perfectly cut. 5 years ago, Clara had tried to return it. He remembered that too. His assistant had told him later. Clara had come to the office, calm, quiet, asked to leave the ring, but the assistant had refused. Company policy. No personal deliveries without confirmation. Alexander stared at the ring. Vanessa had never worn it. He had never given it to her. The thought had never even crossed his mind. Something about that had always felt wrong. Alexander closed the box slowly. His gaze drifted toward the city skyline beyond the glass wall. Somewhere out there, Clara was living a life he knew nothing about. Maybe she had started over. Maybe she had found someone else. Maybe she had forgotten him completely. The thought tightened something in his chest. He remembered her face again. Not the way it had looked when they first met. Not the way it had looked when she smiled, but the way it had looked that night. Broken. As if she couldn't believe he had chosen to believe someone else. Alexander leaned back in the chair, staring out across the endless city lights. 5 years. And somehow the past still hadn't stayed where it belonged. Because the truth was, he had never really stopped wondering where she went, why she never fought back, and whether the biggest mistake of his life had happened in front of hundreds of witnesses or inside his own mind. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows of the pediatric wing, spreading across the polished floors like liquid gold. The hospital moved with a quiet, purposeful energy. Rolling carts, distant laughter from children, the soft rhythm of hurried footsteps through the halls. Dr. Clara Bennett knelt beside a hospital bed, her white coat brushing the floor as she leaned closer to a small boy clutching a stuffed dinosaur. "All right, Liam," she said gently, placing the stethoscope against his chest. "Deep breath for me." The boy puffed out his cheeks and inhaled dramatically. "Like this?" he asked. "Exactly like that," Clara said, smiling. "Perfect." His mother stood nearby, arms crossed with worry. "He's been coughing all night," she murmured. Clara straightened, jotting a few notes on the chart. "His lungs sound clear. Probably just a seasonal virus. We'll keep him comfortable and monitor him tonight." The tension eased from the mother's shoulders. "Thank you, doctor." Clara gave the boy one last warm smile before standing and stepping into the hallway. The corridor was full of movement. Nurses passed with charts in hand. A girl in a wheelchair rolled by, purple balloons bobbing beside her. Murals of animals and bright landscapes covered the walls, watching over everyone who walked beneath them. Clara paused at the nurse's station, reviewing a patient file. "Dr. Bennett," one nurse said, glancing up from a computer. "Room 12 is asking if you can stop by later." "I will," Clara replied calmly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She continued down the hall, her pace steady and confident. People greeted her as she passed. "Afternoon, doctor? Dr. Bennett?" She nodded, acknowledging each one with the quiet poise of someone who had earned respect the hard way. 5 years ago, she had been a girl trapped in a glittering ballroom, surrounded by whispers and stares. Now she was Dr. Clara Bennett, a woman who had rebuilt her life and found her place in a world she controlled. Across the city, a sleek black car stopped outside the hospital. Alexander Whitmore stepped out, his dark suit sharp, almost at odds with the warm human energy inside the building. The lobby smelled faintly of antiseptic and polished floors. Families sat in soft chairs with coffee cups. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency. A hospital administrator approached him immediately. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for visiting the pediatric wing today. Your foundation's contribution has been incredibly helpful." Alexander nodded politely. "I'm glad to hear it." They walked toward the elevators, the administrator speaking enthusiastically about renovations, new equipment, and future plans. Alexander listened with only half his attention, his thoughts drifting despite himself. A ballroom, music, the night of humiliation, a woman standing alone under 100 watching eyes. He pushed the memory away, forcing himself back to the present. The elevator doors opened and they stepped onto the pediatric floor. Immediately, the corridor felt different. Bright murals, children's drawings pinned to bulletin boards, a faint cartoon soundtrack drifting from a nearby room. Life moved here, warm, human, entirely separate from the cold, hollow world of his mansion. As they walked down the hallway, Alexander's attention wandered. Nurses passed. Parents waited outside rooms. Then he saw her. A woman in a white coat, walking with quiet authority, reviewing a clipboard. There was something in the way she moved, precise, calm, assured, that caught him off guard. Something familiar. He slowed. The administrator kept talking. "And the new pediatric imaging system has already..." Alexander wasn't listening anymore. The woman stopped beside a doorway, speaking briefly to a nurse. Then she turned. Time seemed to stop. It was Clara. 5 years had passed. Her hair was neatly pulled back. Her face carried a calm, quiet confidence. But she was unmistakable. Clara Bennett. Alexander froze. The administrator walked a few steps ahead before noticing he had stopped. "Mr. Whitmore?" Clara looked up. Their eyes met. Shock flickered across her face, a brief flash that could have gone unnoticed, but Alexander saw it. The hum of the hallway faded. The laughter of children, the click of nurses' basset shoes, all of it seemed to disappear. For a moment, only she existed. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. Alive. Real. Stronger than he remembered. Not the fragile girl from that glittering ballroom. This woman looked unbreakable. His voice slipped out before he could stop it. "Clara?" Her gaze stayed steady. She straightened, smoothing the shock into something controlled. Professional. Distant. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. The words placed a quiet distance between them. Alexander's eyes flicked again to the white coat. "Dr. Bennett," the administrator said, stepping forward. "Perfect timing. Mr. Whitmore was just touring the pediatric wing." Clara nodded politely. "Welcome to the hospital." Alexander studied her. 5 years of absence narrowed into the woman standing a few steps away from him. "You work here?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. "I've been part of the pediatric department for several years now." The administrator smiled proudly. "Dr. Bennett is one of our best physicians." Clara acknowledged it with a small nod, her composure steady. Alexander felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. She had built a life without him. "You look," he began, then stopped. "Different, stronger, happier." None of the words felt right. Clara waited, calm and composed. The silence stretched. Finally, he said quietly, "It's been a long time." "Yes," she replied. Just one word. The pressure in his chest grew. He wanted to ask everything. Where she had gone, why she had vanished, why she had never defended herself. But the hallway was public, full of eyes. Clara glanced briefly toward a nearby patient room. "I should get back to my patients," she said. Polite, distant, professional. "Of course," Alexander said. She inclined her head slightly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore." Then she walked down the corridor. Her steps were steady, measured, confident. She didn't look back. Alexander watched until she disappeared around the corner. The hallway came back to life, nurses passing, a child's laugh echoing. But he remained still, staring at the empty space she had left behind. 5 years ago, she had stood in front of him in a glittering ballroom, humiliated, alone. Now she had stood there again, but she was no longer that woman. She had survived. She had built something real. And the same thought from the night before returned. Sharper now, harder to ignore. Why had she never defended herself? Alexander exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, the memory no longer felt complete. Something about that night didn't make sense. The doubt refused to leave. Alexander stepped out of the hallway slowly, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished hospital floor. The conversation with Clara still lingered in his mind. It had ended politely, professionally, calmly, too calmly, and yet something about it refused to settle. He hadn't seen her in years, and when he finally had, she had been exactly as he remembered, and completely different at the same time. Composed, distant, stronger. Not the girl he once knew, and somehow that unsettled him more than anger would have. "Mr. Hayes?" The hospital administrator walking beside him spoke gently, pulling him back to the present. Alexander blinked once and turned his attention forward. "Yes?" "We were just about to show you the pediatric wing. The renovation you funded allowed us to expand the play and recovery areas for long-term patients." Alexander nodded automatically. "Yes, of course." His voice sounded normal enough, but his thoughts were still somewhere behind him, in that hallway where Clara had stood. The administrator continued speaking, pointing out equipment, treatment rooms, and therapy stations as they walked. Alexander responded when necessary. But his mind drifted. Her voice, her calmness, the way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with warmth, just distance. A distance that suggested a life he no longer knew. They turned a corner, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. The sharp hospital smell softened. The walls burst with color. Bright murals of forests and oceans covered the corridor. Cartoon animals peeked out from painted trees. A blue whale floated across one wall, smiling down at the hallway. Children's laughter echoed faintly ahead. The administrator smiled. "This is our pediatric play area." Alexander slowed slightly as they approached. Through the wide doorway, he could see a large open room filled with small tables, toys, and shelves of brightly colored blocks. A few children sat drawing while others stacked plastic towers or flipped through picture books. A nurse knelt beside a small girl, helping her fit puzzle pieces together. The room felt warm, alive, completely different from the sterile quiet of the rest of the hospital. Alexander stepped just inside the doorway. For a moment, he simply watched. Children had a way of changing a room. Their voices softened the space. Their laughter made everything feel lighter. His gaze drifted across the room. Then it stopped. At a small table near the window, a boy sat there with a sheet of paper in front of him, holding a thick blue crayon. His small brow was furrowed in concentration as he carefully colored what looked a very large dinosaur. The dinosaur had extremely uneven legs. Alexander felt a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. The boy's tongue stuck out slightly as he worked. It was the kind of expression children made when they were completely focused. Alexander didn't know why he kept looking. Maybe it was the quiet concentration, or the way the afternoon sunlight from the window fell across the child's dark hair. Something about the boy held his attention. Something small. Something he couldn't quite name. The administrator was still explaining something about therapy schedules behind him, but Alexander barely heard it. At that moment, the boy finished coloring. He lifted the page proudly, studying it with clear satisfaction. Then his eyes wandered across the room and landed on Alexander. The boy blinked once. Curiosity lit up his face. Children were rarely shy around strangers in places that felt safe. Alexander saw the exact moment curiosity won. The boy slid off his chair. Clutching the paper carefully, he walked straight toward him. Alexander only noticed when small footsteps stopped right in front of him. He looked down. The boy held up the drawing. "Do you like dinosaurs?" The question was asked with complete seriousness. Alexander blinked once in surprise. Then he crouched slightly to get a better look. The dinosaur filled most of the page. Its legs were uneven. Its teeth were enormous. Alexander studied it just as seriously. That, he said thoughtfully, looks like a very dangerous dinosaur. The boy's face lit up instantly. It's a T-Rex. Of course it is. The boy nodded proudly. My teacher said T-Rex has tiny arms. Alexander leaned a little closer to the page. I see that. The boy watched him carefully, clearly deciding whether this stranger truly understood the importance of dinosaur anatomy. Then Alexander finally looked at the child properly, and something inside him stilled. It wasn't obvious at first, just small details. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a thoughtful expression when the boy tilted his head slightly, waiting for a response. Alexander felt a strange flicker of recognition. He didn't understand it. He had never seen this child before, and yet something about the boy's face felt familiar. The boy shifted his weight slightly. You didn't say if you liked it. Alexander blinked again, realizing he had gone quiet. Yes, he said softly. I like it. The boy smiled with quiet satisfaction. For a brief moment, Alexander noticed something else. The boy pressed his lips together slightly when he was pleased, the exact same way Alexander himself did. The thought brushed against his mind like a faint echo. Too small to hold on to, too strange to follow. Then footsteps approached. Alexander looked up. Clara. She walked toward them calmly from the hallway, a patient chart still in one hand. Her posture remained relaxed, professional. But the moment her eyes landed on Ethan standing in front of Alexander, something in her expression tightened, almost too subtle to notice. Not panic, awareness, a mother noticing something important. Her gaze moved quickly between the two of them. She reached them with steady steps. Ethan, she said gently. The boy turned immediately. Mom, look. He held up the drawing proudly. I showed him my T-Rex. Clara smiled faintly, glancing down at the paper. That's very impressive. Her eyes lifted briefly to Alexander, just long enough to acknowledge him, just long enough to take in the moment. Her voice remained calm. But you shouldn't bother visitors while they're working. Ethan looked confused. I wasn't bothering him. Alexander straightened slightly. It's fine, he said. He was explaining dinosaur science. Ethan grinned again. Clara placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Still, she said softly, guiding him back with quiet authority. It's time to go back to the activity table. The boy nodded reluctantly. Then he looked back at Alexander. Bye. Alexander nodded. Goodbye, Ethan. The name settled strangely in his mind. Clara guided the boy gently toward the hallway. Ethan grabbed her hand easily, still holding the dinosaur drawing in the other. Halfway down the corridor, he turned once more and waved. Alexander raised a hand automatically. Then they turned the corner and disappeared from sight. The playroom noise slowly returned around him. Children laughing, blocks clattering, crayons scratching against paper. The administrator resumed talking about hospital programs, but Alexander barely heard a word. His gaze stayed fixed on the empty hallway. Something about the boy lingered in his thoughts. The hair, the eyes, the small expression he made when he was thinking. A strange uneasiness settled quietly in his chest. He couldn't explain it. It was only a child, a random child in a hospital playroom, and yet the feeling refused to go away. Alexander finally turned away. But the thought stayed in the back of his mind. That boy looked strangely familiar. Alexander Hayes walked slowly beside the hospital administrator as they continued down the pediatric corridor. The tour hadn't ended yet, but his attention had. The administrator was explaining something about the new rehabilitation wing, pointing toward a row of therapy rooms lined with large glass windows. Alexander nodded when appropriate, but his thoughts weren't there. They were somewhere else. Specifically, on a small boy holding a crayon and a dinosaur drawing. The image came back again without warning. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a thoughtful expression, far too serious for someone that young. Alexander exhaled quietly. It was ridiculous, really. He had seen countless children in hospitals before. There was nothing unusual about it, and yet that boy had stayed in his mind in a way he couldn't explain. The administrator kept talking. And thanks to your foundation's donation, we were able to expand this section of the pediatric waiting area as well. Alexander nodded again. Yes, that's good. But even as he answered, the same thought circled back. Why did that child look so familiar? It wasn't something he could point to directly. just small things. A certain shape to the eyes, the way the boy tilted his head slightly while thinking, the quiet seriousness in his expression as he drew. It lingered in Alexander's mind like a half-remembered thought, something he almost recognized but couldn't quite place. He almost asked about him. The question rose naturally to the surface. Who was that boy? But he stopped himself. It would be strange, too personal. The hospital was full of children. There was no reason to single out one, so he said nothing. They walked a little farther down the corridor. The pediatric wing was quieter now. Late afternoon light spilled through the tall windows, soft and golden against the bright murals along the walls. Cartoon animals smiled down from the artwork. Small chairs and toy carts lined the hallway near the playroom entrance. A few parents waited nearby, speaking softly while their children finished their activities inside. The atmosphere felt calmer than before, more peaceful, almost gentle. Two nurses stepped out of a nearby treatment room and walked past them, their conversation drifting casually through the hallway. Dr. Clara's son is here again today. The words reached Alexander before he had time to ignore them. He slowed, almost without realizing it. One nurse laughed softly. He's the sweetest kid, always drawing dinosaurs. The second nurse nodded. He usually waits here until her shift ends. They continued walking down the hall, their voices fading into the background. Alexander stood still for half a second. Dr. Clara's son. So the boy belonged to Clara. The realization settled quietly in his mind, and for some reason that knowledge shifted something inside him. Clara had a child. Of course she did. 5 years had passed. People built lives, started families. Time didn't stop just because one relationship ended badly. It was natural, and yet something about the idea felt strange. Not painful, just distant, like discovering that a chapter of your life had gone on without you. Alexander pushed the thought aside and kept walking. The administrator was already speaking again, gesturing toward a nurse's station farther down the corridor. Alexander followed automatically. Then something small rolled across the floor ahead. A toy car, bright red plastic. It moved quickly along the polished tiles before bumping softly against the base of a wall. A moment later, a small figure darted after it. Alexander recognized him immediately. Ethan. The boy ran lightly down the corridor, completely focused on retrieving his toy. Children moved through space with a kind of fearless momentum adults rarely had. Ethan reached the car and bent down to grab it. And at that exact moment, a rolling medical cart turned the corner behind him. The nurse pushing it didn't see him right away. Everything happened quickly. Alexander reacted without thinking. He stepped forward. His hand reached out instinctively. Careful. His palm caught the back of the boy's small shoulder just as Ethan's foot slipped slightly on the smooth floor. The child stumbled, but didn't fall. Alexander steadied him easily, guiding him upright. The medical cart rolled past safely. The nurse glanced back with a quick apologetic smile. Sorry. Then she continued down the hall. For a brief moment, the corridor went quiet again. Ethan looked up. Recognition flashed across his face almost instantly. Oh! His expression brightened with delighted surprise. It's you. Alexander crouched slightly, making sure the boy had regained his balance. You run pretty fast, he said. Ethan held up the toy car proudly. I was racing him. Him? My dinosaur was winning before. Alexander glanced at the toy car, then back at Ethan. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Of course it was. The boy studied him for a moment with open curiosity. Children had a way of looking at people without hesitation. No judgment, no guarded distance, just simple observation. Then Ethan grinned suddenly. Thanks, Uncle. The words settled softly in the space between them. Alexander blinked once. Uncle. It was such an ordinary word. Children used it for adults they trusted, neighbors, friends, helpful strangers. And yet something about hearing it directed at him felt unexpectedly warm. For a brief second, the strange feeling from earlier returned, that faint sense of familiarity, of connection, of something quietly meaningful. He didn't question it. He simply felt it. You're welcome, he said quietly. Ethan turned the toy car over in his hands, inspecting the wheels carefully. Then he glanced back up. You came back. Alexander tilted his head slightly. I was already here. Oh. That seemed perfectly reasonable to Ethan. Footsteps approached from behind. Alexander looked up. Clara was walking toward them quickly. A patient file still rested in her hand. Her expression was calm, but the moment her eyes landed on Ethan standing in the middle of the hallway, something in her gaze sharpened. A mother's instinct. She reached them in seconds. Ethan. The boy turned immediately. Mom? Clara crouched slightly, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as she looked him over. Not dramatic, just a quick, practiced check. You shouldn't run in the hallway, she said gently. I was racing. I'm sure you were. Her voice softened slightly. Then her eyes lifted to Alexander. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, professional, polite, controlled, but something quieter passed beneath the surface, a flicker of awareness, an understanding that this moment, however small, had brought the three of them into the same space again. Thank you, Clara said. Her tone was sincere. I appreciate you stopping him. Alexander shook his head lightly. It was nothing. Ethan lifted the toy car again. He saved me. Clara gave him a patient smile. I'm glad. Then she placed a gentle hand on his back. Come on, let's go back to the play area. The boy nodded easily, but before leaving, he turned back toward Alexander. Bye, Uncle, he waved enthusiastically. Alexander lifted his hand in return. Goodbye, Ethan. Clara guided him gently toward the playroom entrance. The boy walked beside her happily, still holding his toy car. Halfway down the corridor, he looked back once more and waved again. Then they disappeared around the corner. The hallway grew quiet. Alexander remained standing where he was. The administrator resumed talking nearby about hospital expansion plans. But Alexander barely heard a word. His gaze lingered on the empty hallway where the boy had been standing moments before. A strange thought moved quietly through his mind. Not suspicion, not understanding, just something soft and hard to explain. That boy felt strangely familiar. After a few days, night draped the city in quiet silver light, the hum of distant traffic drifting up from the streets below. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, the skyline stretched endlessly, towers of glass catching the fading glow of streetlights, reflections glinting off polished marble and chrome. Inside, everything was immaculate, controlled, cold. Soft piano music drifted through the living room while a small circle of well-dressed guests lingered near the bar, champagne glasses catching the overhead lights. Vanessa leaned casually against the marble counter, listening to a woman beside her go on about a charity auction. She smiled when necessary, nodded when appropriate, but inside a familiar, dull boredom settled in. These evenings were predictable. Conversations about money, vacations, investments. Who had bought what? Who had been invited to which gala? Impressive, perhaps, but dull. She lifted her glass, taking a slow sip, her eyes scanning the room. Across the floor, two investors laughed quietly with one of Alexander's associates. He was not here tonight, staying late at the office again. Vanessa didn't mind. Distracted by work, he was easier to manage. A familiar voice cut through her thoughts. Vanessa. She turned slightly. Lydia Morgan stood beside her, her silk dress catching the soft glow of the chandelier. Lydia had a way of knowing everything, of letting information come to her without asking. Vanessa offered a polite smile. Lydia, I didn't realize you were coming tonight. I almost didn't, Lydia said lightly, but the view from this place impossible to resist. Vanessa followed her gaze toward the windows. The city was impressive, yes, but her mind was elsewhere. Alexander had chosen this penthouse to project power, control. It all looked effortless. I ran into someone interesting today, Lydia said casually, swirling her champagne. Vanessa's attention sharpened instantly. Oh? Clara Bennett. The name landed like a quiet blade. Vanessa's expression remained composed, but a flicker of irritation stirred deep in her chest. Clara, a chapter she had buried. Clara, she repeated, her voice calm. Yes, she's back in the city. Vanessa's hand rested lightly on the counter. She let the words settle. Interesting. Inconvenient, but not yet dangerous. She works at the Children's Hospital now. Pediatric doctor, I believe, Lydia added. Vanessa's gaze drifted toward the city lights, a slow tightening in her chest. The Children's Hospital. Alexander had mentioned visiting a hospital recently. Donations, public appearances. Her mind began to connect the pieces. That's surprising, she said lightly, controlled. I thought she moved away years ago. She did. Looks like she decided to come back, Lydia said dismissively. Vanessa nodded, her mind already calculating, turning through possibilities. Then Lydia added, almost as an afterthought, Oh, and she has a little boy now. Vanessa's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her champagne glass. A tiny movement, unnoticed by anyone, but inside her mind, everything stilled. A child? She asked, keeping her voice smooth. Yes, I saw them in the hospital lobby earlier this week. He's adorable, Lydia said. How old? Vanessa asked, still calm. About 5. 5. The number hit with quiet force. The room, the music, the guests, everything dimmed for a moment. 5 years ago. 5 years since the engagement scandal. 5 years since Clara disappeared. 5 years since Alexander had cut her out of his life. And now there was a child. The timeline fit too neatly, far too neatly. Vanessa's pulse remained steady, but inside something cold and sharp stirred. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps, but the possibility she hadn't considered tightened around her chest. If the child belonged to Alexander, everything would collapse. Her control, her life, her lies. She set the glass down carefully. How nice for her, she said softly. Lydia nodded, unaware of the storm behind Vanessa's eyes. Vanessa turned toward the window. The city glittered below, but she wasn't really seeing it. Her thoughts drifted back. That night, the party, the accusations, the lies she had put into motion so carefully. Clara had disappeared. Alexander had believed everything. The past had been sealed, until now. A 5-year-old child. The flicker of fear faded, replaced by calculation. Not panic. Control. Strategy. Everything Vanessa did relied on control. And now she had a threat. She moved calmly down the marble-floored hallway to her study. The soft music and distant conversation faded behind her. The study felt colder than the living room, minimal, precise. A single lamp cast pale light over the glass desk. Vanessa picked up her phone. The social mask was gone, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. She scrolled and selected a number. The line rang twice. Yes? I need you to investigate someone, she said, her voice controlled and measured. Name? Clara Bennett. A pause. What exactly do you want? Her eyes drifted to her reflection in the dark window. Everything, where she's been for the last 5 years, where she lives, where she works, who she knows, and most importantly, I want information about her child. Birth records? Yes. Photographs? Yes. Possible father? Her voice dropped, colder now. Especially that. Understood. I'll begin tonight. Vanessa ended the call. She stood still for a moment, thinking, calculating. Then she turned to a hidden cabinet built into the wall and retrieved a small metal box. Inside was her past, an old phone, a USB drive, printed photographs, the tools she had once used, fabricated messages, evidence that had destroyed Clara. Vanessa stared at them briefly. Then, without hesitation, she began to erase everything. Files deleted, photos removed, contacts wiped. The USB drive cleared completely. The printed photographs were torn slowly into pieces. One by one, until nothing remained. The box sat empty in her hands. Her breathing stayed steady. But one thought lingered. Was it too late? Vanessa closed the box and turned off the lamp. The city lights shimmered below. Somewhere in that vast city, Clara was raising a child who might belong to Alexander. Vanessa's expression hardened. No, she would not allow that possibility to destroy everything she had built. Alexander would stay busy, occupied, distracted. The company's gala, public appearances, press, investors, anything to keep him away from Clara and from the child. As she turned to leave, her gaze caught on something she had missed before, a photograph. It had slipped between the folders. Clara, smiling, years younger, unaware. Vanessa picked it up, holding it for a moment. A faint, cold smile curved her lips. You should have stayed gone, she whispered. Outside, the city glittered in silence. And somewhere within it, the truth was already moving closer. The next morning, light poured through the towering glass walls of Alexander Hayes' office, painting long rectangles of pale gold across the polished marble floor. Beyond the windows, the city stretched endlessly. Glass towers reflecting sunlight, traffic threading through wide streets, people already rushing toward meetings and deadlines. From this height, everything looked orderly, predictable, controlled. Alexander Hayes had built his entire life on that idea. Control. He sat behind his expansive desk, reviewing a financial report on the tablet in front of him. Numbers, forecast projections, acquisition summaries. Normally, this kind of work required almost no effort from him. His mind processed patterns quickly. Risk, profit, leverage, timing. Business strategy was something he understood instinctively. But today, the numbers kept blurring. He blinked once. Then again. The graphs on the screen faded into meaningless shapes. Because his attention drifted again. Not to business. To a hospital hallway. To a little boy with dark eyes. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair and exhaled under his breath. Ethan. The boy's name surfaced in his thoughts without invitation. He could still picture him clearly. Small sneakers tapping against the floor. The curious way he tilted his head when asking a question. The way his dark eyes had studied Alexander as if he were trying to figure something out. Something about that child had unsettled him, not in an uncomfortable way, in a way he couldn't quite explain. A strange pull, a quiet familiarity. Alexander rubbed the bridge of his nose and forced his focus back to the tablet. Numbers. Work. Reality. He had no reason to think about a random child from a hospital. The door to his office opened without ceremony. Still pretending to work this early? Alexander looked up. Lucas Carter walked in, already loosening the knot of his tie. Lucas had been part of Alexander's life for more than a decade, first as a university friend, later as a business partner in several ventures. Where Alexander was controlled and analytical, Lucas was relaxed, observant, and far too comfortable speaking his mind. "Someone has to run the company," Alexander said calmly. Lucas dropped into one of the chairs across from the desk. "You have an entire executive team for that." Alexander set the tablet down. "Then what are you doing here at 8 in the morning?" Lucas shrugged casually. "Coffee was terrible at my office." Alexander raised an eyebrow. Lucas leaned forward slightly. "So, I heard something interesting yesterday." Alexander didn't respond. Lucas studied him for a moment before continuing. "Clara Bennett's back in the city." The name settled quietly in the room. Alexander's expression didn't change. "I'm aware," he said evenly. Lucas blinked. "You are?" Alexander nodded once. "I saw her recently." Lucas leaned back, crossing one ankle over the other. "Well," he said slowly, "that must have been awkward." Alexander's gaze drifted toward the city outside the window. Awkward wasn't the word. Unexpected, unsettling, confusing. Lucas watched him carefully. "Funny thing," he added after a moment. Alexander looked back. "What?" Lucas hesitated briefly. "I always thought that night felt wrong." Alexander frowned slightly. "What night?" Lucas gave him a dry look. "The engagement party." The air in the office shifted. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "That situation was resolved years ago." Lucas tilted his head. "Was it?" Alexander's voice remained steady. "Vanessa presented the evidence." Lucas nodded slowly. "Yes, she did." Alexander waited. Lucas leaned forward now, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm not saying Vanessa lied," he said carefully. "But Clara didn't look like someone who had just been caught doing something terrible." Alexander frowned. Lucas continued quietly. "She looked shocked. A beat. Hurt." Another pause, like she didn't understand what was happening. Alexander felt irritation stir beneath his calm exterior. "You weren't the one she betrayed." Lucas lifted a hand slightly. "Maybe not." A brief silence settled between them. Then Lucas added quietly, "But the evidence appeared very quickly that night." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" Lucas shrugged. "I'm not implying anything." He stood up and brushed at his jacket. "I just remember thinking everything moved fast." He walked toward the door. Vanessa had screenshots, messages, explanations, everything ready before anyone even had time to ask questions. Alexander didn't respond. Lucas paused at the doorway. "Anyway," he said lightly, "maybe I'm remembering it wrong." Then he added one last thing. "When I saw Clara that night," Alexander looked up. Lucas held his gaze. "She looked like someone whose entire world had just been destroyed." Then he left. The office door clicked softly shut behind him. Silence returned. Alexander remained perfectly still. Lucas's words lingered in the room, heavier than before. He pushed them aside. There was no point reopening something that had happened 5 years ago. It was finished. Resolved. Still, the image surfaced again. A small boy with dark eyes. Alexander picked up his tablet again. But he didn't start reading. Instead, he opened his calendar. His eyes paused on a note. Foundation Partnership Meeting. Children's Hospital. Alexander stared at the line for several seconds. Then he stood. Late afternoon sunlight filled the children's hospital with warm golden light. The place felt nothing like Alexander's world. Bright murals covered the walls, animals floating through painted skies, balloons tied to cartoon clouds, smiling planets drifting through space. Small plastic chairs were arranged around low tables covered with coloring books and scattered crayons. Children's laughter echoed faintly through the corridors. Nurses moved quickly between patient rooms. Life, noise, warmth. Alexander walked through the lobby in his tailored suit, feeling slightly out of place. A receptionist directed him toward the pediatric wing. He nodded politely and continued down the hallway. Then he saw him. Ethan sat at a small table near the waiting area. His legs swung under the chair as he leaned over a piece of paper, his tongue peeking slightly from the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. Crayons were scattered everywhere. Alexander slowed his steps. The boy looked up suddenly. Recognition flashed across his face. "Hey!" His voice echoed cheerfully down the hallway. "You're the tall man." Alexander felt the corner of his mouth lift despite himself. "Hello, Ethan?" The boy jumped off the chair and ran toward him, stopping right in front of him. "My mom says I shouldn't bother people when they're working," Ethan said seriously. Alexander crouched slightly so they were eye level. "And are you bothering me?" Ethan thought carefully. "Maybe a little." Alexander let out a quiet laugh. "What were you drawing?" Ethan's face lit up instantly. "Oh, come see." Without hesitation, the boy grabbed Alexander's hand and pulled him toward the table. Alexander let himself be led. The drawing lay in the center. 3 stick figures stood side by side, their hands connected by long crayon lines. Above them were uneven labels written carefully in childish handwriting. Mom, me, tall man. Alexander stared at the paper. Something tightened quietly in his chest. "That's a nice drawing," he said softly. Ethan beamed. Alexander pointed gently at the 3rd figure. "Who's the tall man?" Ethan looked up at him as if the answer were obvious. "You." The word landed softly. Alexander looked down again. 3 figures, a family. A strange pressure spread through his chest. Ethan continued happily. "That's my mom. She works here. And that's me. And that's you, because you're really tall." Alexander studied the boy more carefully now. Not casually, closely. The resemblance revealed itself slowly. Dark eyes, the curve of the smile, the way he tilted his head when concentrating. Alexander's breathing slowed. He had noticed something before, but now that he was really looking, it was harder to ignore. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Clara stepped into the waiting area, holding a patient chart. She stopped the moment she saw them. Alexander, standing beside Ethan, Ethan holding the drawing. For a brief second, something flashed across her face. Fear. Not guilt, not anger. Fear. "Ethan," she said softly. The boy turned immediately. "Mom, look what I drew." He held the paper up proudly. Clara walked over, forcing a smile. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Alexander. "Guarded, careful, controlled. Sweetheart," she said gently, "why don't you go put your crayons away?" "But, please." Her tone was soft, but firm. Ethan sighed dramatically, but obeyed, gathering the crayons and wandering toward a toy shelf nearby. Clara turned back to Alexander. "Thank you for keeping him company," she said politely. Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened slightly around the chart in her hand. Alexander studied her quietly. "You seem nervous." "I'm not," she replied quickly. A pause settled between them. The same tension from their last meeting lingered in the air. Clara broke the silence first. "Was there something you needed?" Alexander shook his head slightly. "No, I was just visiting the hospital about a foundation partnership." "Of course," she said. Another quiet pause. Then Ethan ran back over. "Mom, can I take my drawing home?" "Yes," Clara said quickly, but Ethan turned and handed the paper to Alexander instead. "You can keep it if you want." Alexander blinked. "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "So you remember me." Clara stepped forward quickly. "That's very kind, Ethan, but it's okay," Alexander said quietly. He accepted the drawing. Clara fell silent. The moment stretched awkwardly. Finally, Alexander nodded once. "I should go." Clara didn't stop him. Ethan waved enthusiastically. "Bye, tall man." Alexander walked out slowly. Evening shadows stretched across the city streets as Alexander sat inside his car. The drawing rested on the passenger seat. He picked it up again. 3 figures. Mom, me, tall man. He studied the paper carefully, then leaned back in his seat. A thought surfaced slowly. Quiet. Uncomfortable. He whispered it without meaning to. "How old are you, Ethan?" The answer echoed in his memory. 5. Alexander stared out through the windshield. 5 years. 5 years ago, Clara disappeared. 5 years ago, everything fell apart. The timeline formed slowly in his mind. And for the first time since that night, a possibility surfaced, one he had never allowed himself to consider, a possibility that made his chest tighten. What if the greatest mistake of his life hadn't been losing Clara, but believing the lie that drove her away? After a few days, the pediatric corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and orange juice. Morning light slipped through the tall windows, warming the pale blue walls covered with crayon drawings from children who had spent too many days in hospital beds. Paper suns, crooked houses, families drawn with enormous smiles. Clara walked beside Ethan, holding his small backpack in one hand while he skipped along the tiles, the rubber soles of his sneakers squeaking softly with every hop. His energy always amazed her, even after everything, even after illness, even after the long nights in hospital rooms where machines beeped quietly in the dark, even after the life she had fought so hard to build for the two of them alone. Ethan darted ahead 2 steps, then spun around to face her while walking backward. "Race you to the elevator," he said. "You'll win," Clara replied with a small smile. He grinned, satisfied with that answer. They passed the nurse's station. Beside it stood a bright bulletin board. Colorful construction paper letters stretched across the top. Father's Day celebration, tomorrow. Underneath it were drawings from the children, stick figure fathers holding hands with smaller stick figure kids, fathers lifting children into the air. Some drawings had hearts floating around them. Ethan slowed, then he stopped walking completely. Clara took another step before she realized. She turned. He was staring at the board. His small fingers reached out and traced the edge of one of the drawings. "Mom?" His voice was softer than usual. Clara felt something tighten in her chest immediately. "Yes, sweetheart?" Ethan looked up at her. His eyes were curious, open, the kind of innocent curiosity that always made the hardest questions feel heavier. "Do I have a dad?" The hallway noise seemed to fade. Clara's heart skipped once. Then again. For a moment she forgot how to breathe. 5 years. For 5 years she had managed to keep that question away. She forced a gentle smile. "Of course you do." Ethan tilted his head, thinking. Children always thought before they accepted an answer. "Then why doesn't he come see me?" The words were simple, soft, but they landed inside Clara like something sharp. Her fingers tightened around the strap of Ethan's backpack. She crouched so they were eye level. "He doesn't know about you." Ethan processed that slowly, his eyebrows scrunched together the way they always did when he tried to solve a puzzle. "Oh." He looked back at the board. Kids holding their father's hands. "Tomorrow is the school thing," he said. Clara nodded. "I know." Ethan looked back at her. "You'll come, right? Of course I will." For a moment he seemed satisfied, then his voice dropped again. "It's supposed to be Dad's." The sentence wasn't accusing. It was just a fact. But Clara felt it anyway, like a quiet pressure against her ribs. She brushed his hair gently. "We'll still go." Ethan nodded, but his eyes drifted back to the drawings, and Clara knew something had shifted inside him. A small space had opened, a quiet question, one she had spent 5 years trying to protect him from. High above the city, Alexander Reed's office was silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed glass towers and distant traffic far below. Everything in the room spoke of control. Dark wood, perfectly aligned files, a spotless desk, order, precision, except for the single piece of paper lying at the center of the desk, a child's drawing. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair. He had already looked at the drawing too many times since yesterday, but his eyes drifted to it again. 3 stick figures, one small, one with long hair, and one tall. The tall one had absurdly long legs and arms stretching toward the edges of the paper. Above it were uneven letters. Tall man. Alexander rubbed his jaw slowly. He had told himself the same thing every time he looked at it. It meant nothing. Children drew random things. But the longer he stared at it, the harder that explanation became to believe. He flipped the paper absent-mindedly. That was when he noticed the writing on the back. Small. Crooked. Careful. Child's handwriting. Father's Day event tomorrow. Alexander went still. His fingers traced the words lightly. Father's Day. Of course. The drawing suddenly felt heavier in his hands. He imagined Ethan sitting somewhere with a crayon, carefully drawing 3 figures. Mom, me, tall man. Alexander's jaw tightened. Why had the boy drawn him? He leaned back again. Immediately, his mind began building explanations. Coincidence. Curiosity. The kid simply liked him. Nothing more. But another thought slipped through those defenses quietly. He wanted to see Ethan again. Alexander pushed away from the desk and walked toward the window. The city below stretched endlessly. Efficient, unemotional, predictable. Nothing like the strange pull in his chest right now. He looked back at the drawing, picked it up, studied the crooked letters one more time. Just a quick visit. he muttered. He grabbed his coat. The school courtyard buzzed with noise. Children ran everywhere. Bright balloons floated above picnic tables. Colorful banners hung between the trees. Happy Father's Day! The smell of fresh grass mixed with cupcakes and lemonade. Clara stood near the entrance holding Ethan's hand. Fathers surrounded them. Men lifting kids onto their shoulders, laughing, helping tie shoelaces, taking pictures. Ethan watched quietly. His fingers tightened slightly around Clara's hand. She knelt beside him. "We can leave if you want." Ethan shook his head. "No." His voice was small but determined. "I want to stay." Clara nodded, even though something inside her twisted painfully. They stepped further into the courtyard. That's when Ethan suddenly froze. Then his entire face lit up. "Tall man?" Before Clara could react, he let go of her hand and ran. Alexander had just stepped through the gate. His dark suit looked completely out of place among the casual parents and bright decorations. For a second, he hesitated. He almost turned around. Then Ethan crashed into him. "You came!" Alexander blinked down at the boy. Children nearby stared curiously. His hands hovered awkwardly for a second before resting lightly on Ethan's shoulders. "I wasn't sure if I should." Ethan grabbed his hand immediately. "You came." Alexander glanced toward Clara across the yard, then back at Ethan. "If you want me to stay." Ethan's smile widened, bright, unfiltered. "You can be my dad today." The words were soft, simple, but they echoed deep in Alexander's chest. Something shifted there, something unfamiliar. He cleared his throat. "Well?" He squeezed Ethan's hand gently. "All right." Across the courtyard, Clara stood frozen. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The teacher clapped her hands. "All right, everyone. First activity, drawing with your dads." Tables were covered with crayons and blank sheets of paper. Ethan dragged Alexander toward one. "Sit here!" Alexander lowered himself awkwardly into a tiny plastic chair. It creaked loudly. Ethan burst into giggles. "Draw something." Alexander picked up a blue crayon. "What should I draw?" "A plane." Alexander drew a simple airplane. Ethan added clouds, then a stick figure inside the cockpit. "That's you," Ethan said proudly. Something warm stirred in Alexander's chest. Next came the sack race. Alexander hopped awkwardly beside Ethan while children laughed and cheered. For the first time in years, Alexander laughed too. The sound surprised even him. Then they built a small toy airplane together. Ethan focused intensely while Alexander helped snap the wings into place. "You're good at this," Ethan said. Alexander shrugged. "Guess I got lucky." Ethan beamed. Across the courtyard, Clara watched silently. Her chest felt tight. Ethan looked happier than she had ever seen him at a school event. And the man beside him, Alexander, looked different. Less distant. Less untouchable. More human. It hurt in a way she couldn't explain. Children began running across the grass toward the next game. Ethan sprinted ahead. Halfway there, he tripped. His foot caught the edge of a rope. Alexander moved instantly. His arm shot out. He caught Ethan before he hit the ground. "Careful." Ethan blinked up at him, then smiled. Alexander realized he was still holding him. His grip had been immediate, protective, instinctive. Something deep in his chest shifted again. Later, the teacher gathered everyone. "All right, time to introduce your fathers." Children lined up proudly beside their dads. One by one, they stepped forward. "This is my dad, Mark. This is my dad, Jason." Then Ethan stepped forward. The teacher smiled warmly. "And who did you bring today, Ethan?" Ethan pointed proudly at Alexander. "Smack, my tall man." The courtyard seemed to quiet for a moment. Alexander felt something tighten deep in his chest. Across the yard, he saw Clara watching. Her eyes shimmered slightly in the sunlight. Parents began leaving. The courtyard slowly emptied. Ethan hugged Alexander tightly. "Can you come next year too?" Alexander paused, then nodded slightly. "I'll try." Ethan seemed satisfied with that. Clara walked toward them slowly. For a moment, none of them spoke. Alexander looked at Ethan, then back at Clara. Something thoughtful crossed his face. "Clara," his voice was careful. "How old is Ethan exactly?" Clara went still. The air between them felt suddenly heavy. Ethan tugged lightly on Alexander's sleeve, distracted by something across the yard. Alexander kept his eyes on Clara, waiting. But she said nothing. Her silence spoke louder than words. Alexander studied her face, and in that quiet moment, something inside him began to understand. The truth was very close now, closer than either of them were ready to face. And the secret Clara had protected for 5 years was beginning to surface. The chapter ended there, with a question hanging in the air and the feeling that something inevitable had just begun. The city was still awake. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse, thousands of lights stretched across the skyline like a restless ocean of gold. Cars moved in slow streams below, their headlights sliding through the streets like quiet rivers. But inside the penthouse, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Alexander stood by the window, his jacket abandoned on the couch, his sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. The cool glass reflected his silhouette faintly against the night. The events of the afternoon clung to him. Unfinished, unresolved. He should have been exhausted. Instead, sleep felt impossible. His eyes drifted toward the coffee table behind him. A small piece of paper rested there, folded once, carefully. Ethan had handed it to him earlier, after the school event, pushing it forward with a shy grin, as if it were the most important thing in the world. Alexander walked back to the table slowly. He picked up the paper and unfolded it again. Crayon lines. Uneven shapes, bright colors pressed too hard into the page. 3 stick figures stood beneath a wide blue sky. The first figure was small, smiling widely. Next to it stood a taller figure with long yellow hair, and beside them, drawn with thick black crayon, was a much taller figure. Above each one were shaky words. Mom. Me. Tall man. Alexander stared at the drawing for a long time. His chest tightened. A voice echoed in his mind. Ethan's voice. Small. Hopeful. You can be my dad today. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. The boy had said it so naturally, as if the idea made perfect sense, as if it had always been there. His mind drifted back to the moment that followed, to Clara, standing near the school gate, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. Her expression when he asked the question, "How old is Ethan?" She had paused, just for a moment, but Alexander had seen it, seen the tension flicker through her shoulders, seen the way her eyes shifted away from his, and then she had answered, 5. Alexander exhaled slowly. 5. The number had stayed with him all evening. He returned to the window. 5 years. The thought moved through his mind again, this time sharper, more precise. 5 years ago. The engagement party. The accusations. The whispers spreading through the room. Clara standing there, pale and stunned, while Vanessa's voice cut through the silence. 5 years ago. Clara leaving, disappearing. 5 years ago. And Ethan. Ethan was 5. Alexander rubbed a hand across his forehead. No, it couldn't be that simple, could it? His thoughts moved faster now. Dates. Memories. Fragments of the past rearranging themselves. The last evening he had seen Clara before everything collapsed. The week after the engagement party. The night she vanished from the city. 5 years. The same 5 years. Alexander's jaw tightened, his pulse quickened. No. He needed facts, not guesses, not emotions. Facts. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was still waking up. Most of the staff hadn't arrived yet, and the long glass corridors echoed faintly with the sound of his footsteps. He stepped into his private office and closed the door behind him. The city looked different in daylight. Sharper, colder, more unforgiving. Alexander sat behind his desk, but he didn't open his laptop. Instead, he pressed the intercom. Ask Daniel to come in. Yes, Mr. Hayes. A few minutes later, there was a quiet knock. Daniel entered. He had been Alexander's assistant for nearly 7 years, precise, observant, and almost impossibly discreet. Good morning, sir. Alexander gestured to the chair across from him. I need you to look into something. Daniel nodded once. What kind of information? Alexander leaned back slightly. Dr. Clara Bennett. Daniel's expression didn't change, but Alexander noticed the faint flicker of recognition in his eyes. Everyone remembered that name. Find her employment history, Alexander continued. Hospital records, when she began working there, her residency timeline. Daniel began typing on his tablet. Anything else? Alexander hesitated, then said quietly, find out the birth date of her son. Daniel's fingers paused briefly on the screen, but he didn't ask any questions. I'll have the information today. Alexander nodded. And Daniel. Yes, sir? Discreetly. Of course. Daniel left the office. The door clicked shut behind him. Alexander leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The office felt unnaturally silent, too quiet. He picked up his phone and dialed another number. A private medical laboratory. The conversation was brief, professional. By the time the call ended, the technician had already confirmed that a DNA test kit would be delivered to his office that afternoon. Alexander lowered the phone slowly. For a moment, he studied his reflection in the dark screen. This was the rational solution, the logical one. Evidence, proof, and yet, something inside him felt unsettled. It was late afternoon when the memory surfaced again. Alexander had been reviewing the documents Daniel had delivered: hospital schedules, employment timelines, residency records. Clara had started working at the hospital almost immediately after leaving the city. The dates aligned too neatly, too perfectly. Alexander rubbed his temples, and then another memory surfaced. Sharp, unavoidable. The engagement ring. Clara had tried to return it. Daniel had mentioned it years ago, how she had come to the office, how she had insisted on giving it back. Alexander had refused to see her. At the time, he had been furious, humiliated, certain of her betrayal. He had told Daniel to lock the ring away, to keep it somewhere out of sight. Alexander stood slowly. The office suddenly felt smaller. The safe. He walked toward the wall behind his desk. A large abstract painting hung there. He slid it aside. Behind it was the safe. The keypad beeped softly as he entered the code. A quiet click. The door opened. Inside were several sealed folders and small cases, but Alexander's eyes went immediately to a single envelope. Plain, white, slightly yellowed with time. He reached inside and picked it up. A faint layer of dust clung to the paper. 5 years. Alexander turned it over slowly. Clara's name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was the ring. The diamond caught the late afternoon light immediately, flashing sharply. Alexander stared at it. Memories surged through him. The day he bought it, the nervous excitement in his chest, the way Clara's eyes had widened when he slipped it onto her finger, the way she had laughed, half crying, when she said yes. And then something slipped from the envelope. A smaller piece of paper, folded once. Alexander frowned slightly. He unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Clara's. The letters were neat but slightly uneven, as if her hand had trembled while writing. Alexander read the sentence. I didn't betray you. I only loved you. The room seemed to tilt. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His hand tightened around the note. She had written this 5 years ago, before leaving, before disappearing. She had come here alone, trying to return the ring, trying to explain herself, and he had refused to see her. Alexander closed his eyes. A wave of guilt hit him so suddenly it felt almost physical. She hadn't fought, she hadn't shouted, she hadn't tried to defend herself publicly. She had simply left. Left the ring, left the city, left him. The realization cut deeper than anything else. Clara hadn't taken a single thing from him. Not his money, not his reputation, not his name. She had walked away with nothing. Nothing, except a child. Alexander's chest tightened. Slowly, his gaze moved across the desk, to the drawing, the 3 stick figures. Mom, me, tall man, and suddenly Ethan's voice echoed again. You can be my dad today. Alexander sank into his chair. Everything aligned. The dates, the silence, the drawing, the boy's eyes, the same dark eyes Alexander saw every morning in the mirror. It had been there all along, right in front of him. And he had never seen it. A knock broke the silence. Daniel stepped inside. A package arrived for you, sir. He placed a small sealed box on the desk. Alexander didn't need to ask. The DNA test. Daniel hesitated slightly. Do you want the lab to begin the process today? Alexander looked at the box, then at the drawing, then at the note still in his hand. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he shook his head. No. Daniel blinked slightly. You're certain? Alexander leaned back slowly. His voice was quiet. I don't need it. Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. I understand. He left the office. The door closed softly behind him. Alexander sat alone again. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. He looked at the test kit once more, then pushed it gently aside. His gaze returned to the drawing, the 3 figures, the small smiling child between them. Alexander swallowed. The words left his mouth as little more than a whisper. My son. The truth settled over him slowly, heavy, unavoidable. Ethan was his son, and Clara had faced everything alone. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. And Clara deserved better, he murmured. Outside the window, the city lights slowly began to glow again as evening returned. 5 years. For 5 years, the truth had been waiting. Tonight, Alexander finally saw it. Tomorrow, he would make things right. The morning came too bright. Alexander had barely slept. Not because he didn't know the truth anymore, but because he did. It sat inside him now. Heavy, steady, unavoidable. Ethan, my son. The words no longer felt like a question. They felt like something older than him, something that had waited quietly, patiently for 5 years, for him to finally become the kind of man who could carry it. He stood in front of the window in his office, watching the city wake beneath him. 5 years ago, he had watched a different morning, a different ending. He had believed the wrong person. He had let the right one walk away. He had called it certainty. It had been arrogance. Today, his phone buzzed sharply on the desk behind him. Alexander didn't move at first. Then he turned. The screen lit up. Charity luncheon, hosted by Vanessa Bennett. A pause, then another message. Press confirmed. Full attendance. His jaw tightened. Vanessa didn't move without purpose, and she never moved this fast, unless she felt something slipping. A third message, from Daniel. Clara Bennett listed as attending. Silence filled the room. Alexander stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not surprised, not confused, just certain. Then slowly, very slowly, he exhaled. So this was it. She wasn't reacting, she was taking control, and for the first time, he wasn't going to let her. The ballroom was already full when Alexander arrived. Chandeliers cast warm light over polished marble floors. Conversations drifted in controlled tones, glasses clinked, laughter rang a little too sharply. Everything was elegant, everything was watching. He stepped inside, expression unreadable, and immediately he felt it, that subtle shift in the air, something already in motion. His gaze moved across the room, and then he saw her. Clara stood near the center of the space, simple, still, no effort to stand out, and yet impossible to ignore. She wasn't speaking, wasn't defending herself, wasn't explaining, but people were watching her, whispering, judging. Again, the same room, the same silence, the same kind of cruelty, just dressed better. Something cold settled in Alexander's chest. Not anger, not yet. Something deeper, recognition. Not again. Vanessa stood a few steps away. Perfect, polished, untouched. A glass of champagne rested effortlessly in her hand. Her smile, measured, practiced, too perfect to be real. And I tried to stay quiet, Vanessa was saying, her voice smooth, almost generous. I really did, but there are limits to what I can ignore. People leaned in, curiosity sharpening into something hungry. Clara didn't move, didn't react. Vanessa's gaze slid toward her. I think everyone deserves to know, she continued softly, what kind of person we're really dealing with. The room grew quieter. Anticipation, judgment waiting for direction. Vanessa tilted her head. A woman who disappears for years, only to return with a child and a story. A ripple passed through the crowd. Alexander's hands tightened at his sides. Vanessa stepped closer, slow, deliberate, predatory. You expect people to believe that's a coincidence? She asked lightly. Or is it strategy? Clara didn't answer. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, but her fingers barely curled inward. A small thing, almost invisible. But Alexander saw it. She wasn't unaffected. She was holding on, holding everything together. And the room misread it as guilt. She's using him, Vanessa added, softer now, more intimate. Using a child to trap a man who has already moved on. A few nods. Quick, comfortable. People loved easy truths, even when they were wrong. Something inside Alexander shifted, not anger. Not yet. Something colder, something final. Clara finally spoke, quiet, steady, but there was something under it now, fatigue. I didn't come here for this, Vanessa smiled faintly. But you came. The words landed like a trap closing. Clara held her gaze, didn't step back, didn't break. And for a brief moment, Vanessa's smile flickered, because Clara wasn't collapsing. She wasn't playing her role. That's enough. The voice cut cleanly through the room, low, controlled, final. Every head turned. Alexander stood at the edge of the crowd, still, composed. But something about him had shifted. The room felt it. Before they understood it, Vanessa blinked. Surprise. Then, relief. Alexander, she said, stepping toward him, I'm glad you're here. I was just... That's enough. He didn't raise his voice, but it landed heavier the second time. Vanessa stopped, and for the first time, she didn't know what came next. Alexander stepped forward slowly, each step deliberate, measured. His gaze stayed on Vanessa. Not yet on Clara. 5 years ago, he said evenly, I made a mistake. Confusion flickered through the room. Vanessa's smile tightened. Alexander, this isn't the place. I believed something without questioning it. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her. I chose pride over the truth. Now, they were listening. Really listening. Vanessa's composure shifted, slightly. A crack, small, but real. Then he turned. just enough, toward Clara. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked away. For the first time in 5 years, neither did he. She came back, he said quietly, to return something that was never hers to keep. A murmur spread. Vanessa's grip tightened around her glass. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice lower now. "Careful." Alexander ignored her. "She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for anything. She left with nothing." Each sentence stripped the past down to the truth. No emotion, no defense, just fact. Vanessa shook her head quickly. "This is ridiculous. I know exactly what I'm saying." Sharp, final, unmovable, and the room shifted. Alexander's gaze moved again. To Clara, then to Ethan. The boy stood close to her now, watching, trying to understand a world that suddenly made no sense. Alexander felt it, that pull, that recognition, that quiet, undeniable bond. And then he said it. "Ethan is my son." Silence. Not fragile, not uncertain, absolute, the kind that rewrites everything that came before it. Vanessa's glass slipped slightly. "What?" someone breathed. "That's not—" Vanessa's voice cracked. She forced it steady. "That's not true." Alexander didn't look at her, didn't need to. "It is. No emotion, no doubt, just truth." "No," Vanessa said quickly, stepping forward. "No, this is exactly what she wanted. This is what she planned." "Stop." Steel, cold, unyielding. Vanessa froze. "You don't get to speak for her anymore." That was the moment. Not the reveal, not the confession. That, because it took everything Vanessa had built and erased it. "I tried to warn you," she pushed, her voice rising now. "She's manipulating you. She always has." Enough. No return. Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped, because no one was watching her anymore. Not really. The room had moved on, from her. Daniel stepped forward, precise, controlled. "Mr. Hayes, the records you requested have been verified." Attention shifted. Curiosity turned into confirmation. "Dr. Bennett left the city 5 years ago. Her son was born shortly after. There were no financial transfers, no contact, no requests, no embellishment, no argument, just truth aligning with truth." Vanessa stepped back. "No, this is being twisted," but the words didn't land, didn't hold, didn't matter. Alexander turned fully toward Clara. Everything else disappeared. The noise, the people, the history, just her. "I was wrong." Simple. No defense. "I should have listened." A breath. Then, "You deserved better." Not dramatic, not loud, but this time everyone heard it. Clara held his gaze, long, steady, and now there was something there. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something had shifted because this time the world saw what she had carried alone. "I did," she said softly. And it wasn't anger, it was truth, claimed. "Mom?" Ethan stepped closer. His small hand found Clara's, grounding. His eyes moved between them, trying to build a bridge between two worlds. Then he looked at Alexander. "Are you my dad?" The real question. The only one that mattered. Alexander stepped forward. Slow, careful, like the moment could break if he rushed it. He lowered himself to Ethan's level. His voice softened. Stripped of everything else? Yes. No promises. No performance, just truth. Ethan watched him, searching, and then he nodded, not because he understood everything, but because something inside him recognized it. Vanessa stood at the edge of the room, perfect, untouched, irrelevant. She tried to speak again, but the room had already decided she wasn't part of this anymore, and that was worse than losing. Alexander stood. He didn't reach for Clara, didn't assume a place he hadn't earned. He just stood beside them, not in front, not above, beside. Clara's hand tightened slightly around Ethan's. She didn't move away, but she didn't close the distance either. Not yet. And that space said everything. The room slowly came back to life. But something had shifted, not just in the room, in the story itself. For 5 years, the truth had lived in silence, hidden, ignored, twisted. Today, it had been seen, heard, understood. And for the first time, it didn't belong to the past anymore. It stood beside him.